Midnight. The sleet in East Boston felt like shattered glass against my cheeks. I fumbled with the keys to my low-rent apartment complex, my fingers completely numb. The heating in the building had been broken for 3 days, and my cheap canvas shoes were soaked through to the freezing socks underneath. I just wanted to get inside, lock the deadbolt, and check on my younger brother Leo. His medical bills, a crushing, suffocating weight, never allowed me a full breath. The $342,000 debt he had inherited hung over us like a guillotine. Before the key could even catch in the rusted lock, a hand slammed against the cheap wood of the door next to my head. Not so fast, Clara. The smell of stale bourbon and desperation hit me a second, before Marcus Thorne stepped out of the shadows of the stairwell. A physical manifestation of the nightmare I thought I had escaped. My ex-husband looked exactly as pathetic and dangerous as he had the day I finally signed the divorce papers. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight with the erratic, volatile energy of a man drowning in his own bad choices and looking for someone to pull down with him. Marcus, I kept my voice flat, employing the clinical detachment I used when dissecting fraudulent tax returns. It's midnight. You are violating the restraining order. Leave. I need your signature. He pulled a crumpled sheaf of financial documents from his jacket, shoving them toward my chest. Just sign the guarantor line, Clara. It's a bridge loan. If I don't get the cash by tomorrow, the guys from the South End are going to break both my legs. You owe me. I owe you nothing. I stepped back, my spine hitting the door. And I am not signing my name to another one of your illegal offshore transaction ledgers. Leo is already suffocating under a debt because of you. I won't let you leverage what's left of our lives. Marcus's face twisted into something ugly. His hand shot out, his fingers digging into my left shoulder with bruising force. Right over the hairline fracture he had given me 2 years ago that had never healed correctly because I couldn't afford the copay for a specialist. The pain was immediate, a sickening spike of copper in my mouth. You think you're so smart, he hissed, his grip tightening as he backed me against the freezing brick. You're just a glorified calculator, Clara. You sign the paper, or I swear to God I'll make sure Leo doesn't make it to his next treatment. I tried to pull away, my heart hammering a frantic, elevated 112 beats per minute. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. I needed leverage. The ambient temperature in the alleyway seemed to drop 10 degrees. There was no shout, no dramatic entrance, just the sudden, terrifying realization that the shadows behind Marcus had coalesced into something solid. Marcus froze, like a predatory beast had just revealed itself, and every prey animal in the vicinity suddenly remembered what fear tasted like. A man stepped into the dim, flickering light of the broken street lamp. He easily cleared 6'3", moving with the silent, fluid grace of something that belonged at the top of the food chain. He wore a bespoke charcoal Italian suit under heavy outerwear. His eyes were the color of slate under deep water, cold and entirely unreadable. Dante Ricchetti, the most dangerous man in Boston. Remove your hand from her, Dante said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that didn't just carry through the freezing air. It vibrated against the concrete. It wasn't a request. Men who ruled the underworld with quiet, calculated brutality never needed to raise their voices. Marcus let go of my shoulder as if he had been burned. He stumbled backward, his bravado evaporating into sheer, trembling terror. Hey man, this is a private conversation. My wife and I are just. She is Clara Hensley. She is not your wife, Dante interrupted, stepping forward. The sheer physical size of the man was overwhelming. And you have precisely 3 seconds to disappear from my line of sight, before I have Silvio remove your vocal cords. From the darkness near a sleek, armored SUV idling at the curb, Silvio Gallo materialized. The capo didn't say a word. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his dark suit, a gesture that promised immediate, fatal violence. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dropped the crumpled financial documents onto the wet pavement and ran, his footsteps echoing frantically down the alley until they were swallowed by the storm. I stood there, shivering violently, my cheap trench coat completely useless against the biting wind, and the residual adrenaline crashing through my system. I wrapped my arms around my chest, trying to regulate my breathing. Dante looked at me. His gaze traced the rigid line of my posture, the white-knuckle grip I had on my satchel, and the bruised shadows under my eyes. Without a word, he unbuttoned his heavy outerwear. He stepped close, so close the freezing rain seemed to stop before it could touch us, and draped his bespoke wool coat over my shoulders. It was a heavy, Dark gray cashmere coat smelling of cedar and leather, acting as an initial physical shield of protection against the brutal night. The sheer weight of the fabric grounded me. The residual warmth from his chest seeped into my freezing bones, acting as an absolute barrier between me and the ugliness of the world. "Get your things, Clara," he instructed quietly, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second on my collar. "You have something that belongs to me, and I have something you want." The transition from the freezing alley to the interior of the armored SUV was a smash cut of sensory extremes. The air inside was perfectly climate-controlled, wrapping around me in a cocoon of quiet safety. I sat rigidly in the leather seat, clutching the heavy cashmere coat around myself. The black cardboard box rested securely on my lap. I had packed it earlier tonight in a fit of desperate calculation. We drove through the storm in silence, the violent streaks of neon city lights smearing against the reinforced bulletproof glass. I focused on my pulse, forcing it down from a frantic sprint to a steady, manageable rhythm. I could not afford to let my trauma dictate my actions. I was a forensic accountant. I traded in logic, in ledgers, in undeniable mathematical truths. That was my armor. 20 minutes later, the private elevator doors hissed open on the 74th floor of the Rocketti Enterprise building. It felt like an altitude drop, the kind that sucked the oxygen directly from your lungs. I focused on the mechanical hum of the ventilation system, counting the exact seconds it took for the atmospheric pressure to equalize in my ears. 3.2 seconds. I followed Dante down the wide, pristine, dark marble hallway. The space did not feel like a standard corporate headquarters. It was magnificent and oppressive, heavy with the scent of old paper, leather, and cigar smoke. One wall was entirely glass, overlooking the violent January storm battering the harbor. The other walls were lined with mahogany bookshelves, filled with legal texts, history, and philosophy. Not decoration, a testament to a calculated mind. Dante walked behind his massive desk, carved from a single slab of black walnut, and turned to face me. He didn't sit. He merely waited, the slow coiling of his broad shoulders beneath his bespoke suit, the only warning of his absolute focus. I stopped exactly 3 feet from the edge of his desk. I was hyper-aware of how out of place I looked. A woman in canvas shoes engulfed in his bespoke outerwear, clutching a battered archive box. But I ignored the primal, screaming instinct in the back of my brain, telling me I was out of my depth. I placed the black cardboard box, my worn-out archive containing Marcus's illegal offshore transaction ledgers and my personal forensic notes, squarely on the polished wood. I took a deep breath, the scent of his cologne rising from the collar of the coat to steady my frayed nerves. "You are holding a marker on my brother, Leo," I began, forcing my tone into a flat, clinical cadence. $342,000, accrued through illegal offshore gambling rings, run by your subordinates in East Boston, plus a 12% weekly VIG that makes repayment mathematically impossible for a civilian. Dante leaned his hands on the desk. He was letting the silence stretch, a classic interrogation tactic designed to make the target fill the void with nervous babble. But I had survived years of Marcus's manipulative cruelty. I knew how to endure the quiet menace of a dangerous man. I simply stood my ground, my spine painfully straight, maintaining eye contact until the slate gray of his eyes seemed to narrow by a fraction of a millimeter. "The box," Dante prompted softly, his gaze dropping to the worn cardboard before rising back to my face. "What is in it, Clara?" "Leverage," I said smoothly, opening the lid. I pulled out a thick stack of printed spreadsheets, every margin covered in my red ink, every discrepancy highlighted with ruthless precision. I slid the stack across the walnut surface. "These are Marcus's illegal offshore transaction ledgers. Over the past week, I forensically tore them apart, and in doing so, I tore apart the financial infrastructure of your East Boston operations." Dante did not reach for the papers immediately. He simply watched my face. "Your subordinates on the street level are running a sloppy operation," I continued, my voice unwavering despite the sudden, terrifying spike in my adrenaline. "They are routing their illicit gains through shell companies registered in Delaware and Cyprus, using standard cryptographic tumbling to hide the origins. But they are lazy. They reuse IP addresses. They transfer uniform amounts at uniform intervals. If I can untangle their offshore shell game using just a cheap laptop and public records, the IRS and the RICO task force are already 3 steps behind. You are vulnerable." The air inside the office seemed to freeze. "You hacked into the financial footprint of my street-level operators." "I audited them," I corrected firmly. I am a forensic accountant. I look at numbers, and they speak to me in ways they don't to your enforcers. I can see the structural weaknesses in a balance sheet, the way an architect sees a cracked foundation. Your East Boston men are leaving digital footprints that lead directly back to this building. I tapped my index finger against the stack of papers. I didn't bring this to you to threaten you. I brought it to prove my competence, to prove my value, in exchange for what? The words were quiet, edged with something sharp and lethal. Leo's debt is wiped clean. Today, I stated, my chin lifting an inch. And in return, I will work for you. I will conduct a full internal audit of your legitimate corporate maritime logistics and your shadow ledgers. I will find every leak, every sloppy transaction, every vulnerability your people have overlooked, and I will restructure your systems so that they are bulletproof. You get absolute financial security, and my brother lives. That is the transaction. Dante stood at his full height. He moved around the desk with the silent grace of a wolf, stopping mere inches from me. My breath caught in my throat, a shallow, ragged intake of air, but I locked my knees to keep from stepping backward. The intoxicating scent of cedar and dark whiskey wrapped around me all over again, contrasting violently with the sterile, terrifying logic of the deal I was proposing. He looked down at me, studying the defensive tilt of my chin and the rigid professional mask I had plastered over my exhaustion. He reached out. I flinched, a microscopic, involuntary jerk of my shoulders, bracing for a blow that my trauma told me was inevitable. Instead, his long fingers grazed the heavy cashmere collar of the coat I wore, his thumb brushing a stray, wet lock of hair away from my cheek. His touch was shockingly warm, gentle in a way that defied every rumor I had ever heard about him. You are offering to bind yourself to my organization, Dante murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips before rising back to my eyes. To me. Do you understand what that means, Clara? In my world, when I claim something is mine, I protect it absolutely. If we do this, if we become this, you're mine. Fully, and I don't share. I don't let go. My heart slammed against my ribs, a panicked bird trapped in a cage of bone. I needed distance. I needed the safety of sterile, professional boundaries. If I let him see me as a woman, if I let him step past the armor of my competence, I would be destroyed. I had already survived one monster. I could not afford to be consumed by a king. I took a deliberate half-step back, breaking his physical proximity. I squared my shoulders, raising my chin to look the city's reigning kingpin dead in the eye. I understand the terms of my employment, I said, my voice deliberately flat, stripping every ounce of emotion from the syllables. I will audit your ledgers. You will spare my brother. I look forward to working for you. I paused, weaponizing the next word, using it to build an impenetrable wall of glass between us. Boss. Something dark and volatile flashed in Dante's eyes. A muscle feathered at his jawline. He stared at me for a long, heavy moment, the silence stretching until my lungs burned. The word hung in the air between us, a clear transactional boundary. Not a protector, not a savior, just an employer. He hated it. I could see it in the sudden, violent tension of his knuckles. But I needed it. It was the only armor I had left. The silence following my declaration was absolute. The storm outside seemed to fade into white noise. Against the oppressive, charging atmosphere inside the office, Dante did not yell. He did not slam his fist against the mahogany desk. His fury was a quiet, suffocating thing bleeding into the room drop by drop. Boss, the Don repeated slowly, tasting the word as if it were coated in ash. The syllable sounded foreign in his mouth, harsh and entirely inadequate for the sudden, intense possessiveness radiating from his posture. He tilted his head, his gray eyes narrowing as they systematically dismantled my professional facade. Is that what you think this is, Clara? A corporate acquisition? It is a negotiation of services, I replied, refusing to break eye contact. My fingernails dug into the edges of the cardboard box so hard my palms ached. I have a skill you require. You hold a debt I cannot pay in cash. The terminology fits the parameters of our arrangement. I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. He saw exactly what I was doing. He recognized the defensive mechanism for what it was. A desperate attempt by a wounded woman to maintain a modicum of control in a situation where she had none. But Dante was a strategist above all else. If I needed a transactional cage to feel safe enough to lower my guard, he would build that gilded cage for me. For now. He turned his back to me, walking slowly back to his desk. He pressed a silver intercom button near the edge of the wood. Silvio, in here. Less than 15 seconds later, the heavy oak double doors opened silently. Silvio Gallo stepped into the room. If Dante was the commanding presence of the syndicate, Silvio was its executioner. The capo was a man of average height but built like a vault, his dark suit hiding the lethal efficiency of a ghost. He didn't carry the arrogance of a street thug. He carried the quiet, observant stillness of a professional who calculated the easiest way to break a neck before he even said hello. "Sir," Silvio said, his voice a low gravel. His dark eyes flicked to me, taking in the oversized cashmere coat drowning my frame, the shivering I was desperately trying to suppress, and the stacks of red-inked papers sitting on the desk next to the black cardboard box. He processed the variables in a fraction of a second and returned his attention to his superior. "Clara has just provided a forensic analysis of the East Boston gambling rings. They are leaving us exposed to federal scrutiny," Dante stated, his tone devoid of any inflection. He tapped the top of the ledger stack. "Verify the methodology. If her mathematics hold, mobilize the extraction teams. I want the men running that specific operation found and brought to the warehouse before sunrise. We do not tolerate operational liabilities." Silvio stepped forward, smoothly collecting the stack of papers. "Understood. And Silvio," Dante added, lowering his tone an octave, carrying a weight that caused goosebumps to erupt across my skin. "Draft an ironclad contract. Leo Hensley's outstanding balance is to be frozen indefinitely. Clara will be assuming the principal through operational consulting." Silvio's right eyebrow twitched, the only sign of surprise the man allowed himself. "Standard employment terms, boss?" "No," Dante said softly, his gaze sliding back to me. The predatory focus returned, stripping away the illusion of a standard corporate hiring process. "Ironclad. She is under my direct jurisdiction. Her brother is to be moved to a secure location under our protection immediately. No one outside my personal security detail approaches him, and no one touches her. Discretion is absolute. I don't need physical protection," I interjected, my voice sharper than I intended. The panic was clawing its way back up my throat. "My brother needs to be shielded from the loan sharks, yes. But I just need access to your digital servers. I can work from my apartment. I have a secure VPN. You will not be returning to your apartment," Dante cut me off. It wasn't a raise in volume. It was the sheer, crushing absolute of his authority. "If you are going to rip apart my logistics and audit my internal frameworks, you will make enemies inside this organization. The men you expose will kill you the moment they realize they are bleeding out. You are a liability out in the open." "I am not negotiating the terms of my surrender," I argued, my voice trembling slightly as the reality of my situation crashed down on me. I gripped the edges of the archive box tighter, my knuckles white. "I am clarifying the job description. I can't just disappear. I have a life. I have." "You have nothing," Dante said, stepping closer again. The brutal truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't being cruel. He was stating a forensic fact. "You have an abusive ex-husband named Marcus Thorne who stalks your building. You have an eviction notice taped to your door. You have a brother who is going to be found in the harbor by tomorrow morning if you hadn't walked up to my vehicle tonight." I flinched. The old fracture throbbed in rhythm with my racing heart, exactly where Marcus's fingers had dug in earlier. I hated that Dante knew. I hated that my meticulous attempts to remain invisible, to survive quietly in the cold shadows of Boston, had been entirely laid bare before him. He had run a background check. Of course he had. A man running a massive syndicate did not entertain deals with desperate civilians without knowing the exact dimensions of their tragedy. "You don't know me," I whispered, the clinical detachment finally cracking just a fraction. "I know exactly who you are, Clara," Dante replied, his voice softening, shifting to a hushed, intimate register that was entirely at odds with the violent world he commanded. "You are a woman who walked into a lion's den with a ledger and a demand, ready to sacrifice everything to save family. You are brilliant, you are terrified, and you are not leaving my sight." He turned back to Silvio. "Draft the paperwork. She stays on this floor. Have the guest quarters in the penthouse prepared. Send a team to retrieve whatever belongings she needs from her apartment." The capo gave a curt nod. "It will be done, boss." Silvio turned and exited the room, the heavy doors clicking shut behind him. The finality of the sound echoed in my chest. I was trapped. I had successfully navigated the immediate threat of Leo's execution, but in doing so, I had chained myself to a man whose gravitational pull was terrifying. He wasn't just offering a job. He was demanding total physical and geographic control. The illusion of my independence had been stripped away in less than 10 minutes. Dante walked around the desk and stopped in front of me again. He looked at the heavy cashmere coat still draped over my shoulders. His coat, enveloping me in his scent, his warmth, his protection. He reached out and gently adjusted the lapel, his knuckles briefly grazing my collarbone. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. "You will review the contract when Silvio finishes it," Dante said quietly, his gray eyes locked onto mine. "You will sign it, you will audit my ledgers, and you will do it from my penthouse, where I can see you." I pulled the lapels of the dark cashmere tighter around myself, fighting the traitorous wave of relief that came with the profound sense of safety. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I nodded once, slowly, my throat tight. "Understood," I managed to say, my voice a hollow whisper. I forced myself to look up, to reinforce the only barrier I had left, against the overwhelming tide of the man standing before me. I needed the clinical sutures of professionalism to hold my fractured reality together. "Thank you, boss." Dante's jaw tightened again. The muscle feathered. He stared at me, the gray of his eyes darkening like a storm front rolling in over the harbor. He hated the word. It was a dirty corporate label that insulted the primal, absolute protection he was extending to me. But he didn't snap. Not yet. He simply turned away, the silence in the room heavy with the unspoken promise that the fragile transactional wall I had just built would not stand for long. The guest quarters on the upper tier of the Ricchetti penthouse did not resemble a cage. But my analytical mind immediately mapped the parameters of my confinement. I stood in the center of the vast space, my cheap, soaked canvas shoes sinking into the thick pile of a hand-woven Persian rug. My eyes darted across the architecture, automatically calculating the structural realities of my new environment. The heavy mahogany doors were flush with the frame, hiding reinforced steel core hinges. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Harbor were thick, at least 2 inches of ballistic-grade polycarbonate disguised as architectural glass. There were no blind spots. The room's climate was precisely calibrated, a warm, sterile 72 degrees that stood in stark contrast to the freezing, violent sleet still battering the city below. It was a fortress wrapped in velvet. A violent shiver racked my frame, a delayed physiological response to the adrenaline crash, and the lingering dampness of my clothes. My scarred collarbone pulsed in a steady, dull rhythm, right where Marcus had dug his fingers into my old fracture earlier tonight. I pulled the dark cashmere tighter around my chest. The heavy, dark gray cashmere was still holding the residual heat of his body, emitting the rich, grounding scent of cedar, expensive leather, and dark whiskey. It was a tactical error to find comfort in his scent, to allow my somatic hypervigilance to be soothed by the very man who had just dismantled my life and reassembled it under his absolute jurisdiction. But the shivering deep in my bones hadn't fully subsided, and the coat was the only barrier, keeping me from completely falling apart. The heavy door clicked open. There was no knock, no warning, just the silent, fluid entry of the man who owned the airspace I was currently breathing. Dante stepped into the room. He had discarded his suit jacket, somewhere between his office and here. The bespoke charcoal vest tailored perfectly to the broad, imposing lines of his torso, emphasizing the sheer physical power he usually kept concealed behind elegant wool. The sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt were rolled up to the elbows, revealing corded forearms and the faint, dark edge of syndicate ink disappearing beneath the cotton. He didn't move like a corporate executive. He moved like a predator surveying its secured territory. He didn't speak immediately. He analyzed me, taking in my rigid posture the defensive, white-knuckled grip I had on the lapels of his coat, and the absolute refusal in my eyes to shrink under his intense gaze. In his right hand, he held a garment, a woven blanket. It was a deep liquid emerald color, the fabric so impossibly fine it looked as though it would slip through water without causing a single ripple. "Your clothes are damp," Dante stated, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated against the quiet acoustic perfection of the room. "The housekeeping staff drew a bath for you. They left fresh garments in the adjoining suite, but they thought you might need this until the ambient temperature of your core stabilizes." He stepped forward, offering the woven blanket. The gesture was deceptively simple. To an outside observer, it was an act of basic hospitality, a wealthy host tending to a guest who had been caught in a storm. But in the clinical, hypervigilant architecture of my mind, it was a test of perimeters. It was a psychological tripwire, a line I could not afford to cross. I knew exactly what accepting that fabric meant. To accept a personal comfort from a mafia don, To allow him to replace the armor of my cold reality with the soft, luxurious embrace of his wealth was to acknowledge a dynamic that existed outside the strict bounds of a W-2 employment contract. It was a concession. It was a step into the gilded cage he was building around me. I didn't reach for the fabric. Instead, my jaw tightened, and I gripped the heavy wool of his coat even harder, stepping back a fraction of an inch to maintain the spatial boundary between us. "That won't be necessary," I replied, forcing my voice into the flat, even cadence I used during hostile tax audits. I employed the clinical detachment that had kept me alive for years. "I am perfectly fine. I will change into whatever generic uniform your staff provides for operational consultants once I have reviewed the non-disclosure agreements." Dante's extended hand paused in mid-air. The emerald fabric caught the soft, recessed lighting of the room, highlighting the sheer, decadent luxury of the material. His slate gray eyes darkened, tracking the stubborn defensive line of my jaw. "It is not a uniform, Clara. It is a gift," he said quietly, his tone edging into a dangerous dark register that sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. "You are freezing. You are in pain. You do not need to fight the people who are trying to warm you." "I am not fighting," I countered smoothly, though my heart rate kicked up a notch, beating visibly at the base of my throat as the proximity between us crackled with unspoken tension. "I am simply adhering to the parameters of our arrangement. You are providing me with secure lodging and access to your digital servers in exchange for my forensic analysis. Luxury garments do not fall under the purview of my compensation package. I prefer to keep my ledgers balanced, and I do not accept unearned assets." A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. The air grew thick, charged with the sheer force of his suppressed will. Dante slowly lowered his hand, the woven blanket draping over his knuckles like a spilled jewel against his bruised skin. He stepped closer, invading my personal space with the deliberate, inescapable gravity of a man who is used to the world bending to his exact specifications. I locked my knees to keep from retreating further. I could smell the cedar and leather radiating from his skin, a potent, intoxicating warmth that warred violently with the sterile, terrifying logic of the boundary I was trying to enforce. "You think you can manage me with spreadsheets and corporate jargon," Dante murmured, his voice dropping so low, it was almost a physical weight pressing against my collarbone. "You think if you categorize every interaction as a transaction, you can maintain control over a situation that you lost control of the moment you walked into my alley?" "I think," I breathed, my pulse hammering a frantic, elevated rhythm against my throat, "that maintaining a strict professional boundary is the only logical way to ensure the survival of the working such a relationship." I paused, meeting his intimidating gaze with a defiant, terrified clarity. I weaponized the one word I knew would establish the impenetrable wall of glass between us. "I am your employee, nothing more. Boss." The word hit the air between us like a physical strike. A muscle in Dante's jaw feathered violently, his eyes, normally as cold and unreadable as winter ice, flared with a sudden, dark irritation. It was a microscopic shift, a slight tightening of his mouth, a fractional narrowing of his gaze, the sudden stillness of his broad shoulders. But to a man who controlled a criminal empire with absolute calculation, it was the equivalent of a primal scream. He hated the title. I could see it in the sudden tension of his knuckles gripping the fabric. It was a dirty corporate label that insulted the absolute, possessive protection he was extending to me. It reduced the intense, dangerous dynamic between us to a sterile, administrative function. But he didn't yell. He didn't snap, and he didn't force the woven blanket into my hands. He simply stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his brilliant intellect warring with a much darker, older instinct that wanted to tear down every defensive wall I had ever built. "You can hide behind your titles for tonight, Clara," Dante finally said, his voice a lethal, velvet promise that offered absolutely no comfort. He tossed the heavy blanket onto the edge of the velvet chaise lounge, the fabric pooling in the shadows like liquid glass. "But the ice you are standing on is much thinner than you calculate. Get some sleep." He turned and walked out of the room, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in my chest. I exhaled a shaky breath, my knees suddenly weak. The room was warm, the security was absolute, but as I stared at the emerald fabric resting on the velvet, I knew the real danger wasn't the freezing storm raging outside. It was the man who had just left, and the terrifying realization that my clinical armor was already beginning to crack. 2 weeks passed in a hyper-vigilant routine. I slowly adjusted to the quiet luxury of my new life, though I never allowed myself to forget the precarious nature of my employment. The black cardboard box, containing Marcus's illegal offshore transaction ledgers and my personal forensic notes, sat tucked away in the corner of my suite, a silent anchor to the violent reality I had narrowly survived. My survival depended on maintaining my utility. My younger brother, Leo, relied on me entirely for his medical treatments, and those treatments required a steady, heavy flow of capital. The crushing financial anxiety never truly left me. It merely lay dormant under the surface, driving my obsessive need to prove my worth. It was Tuesday morning of my second week, and the relentless sleet of that first night had given way to a sharp, brilliant winter sun. The digital clock mounted on the reinforced steel wall of Dante's corporate office in the financial district read exactly E09:14 a.m. This space was a high-altitude sanctuary of legitimate corporate power, far removed from the underground grittiness of the streets below. The office was magnificent. It smelled of old paper, leather, and the rich, dark aroma of espresso. One wall was entirely ballistic-grade glass, offering a panoramic view of the bustling Boston harbor. The other walls were lined with mahogany bookshelves filled with heavy maritime law volumes, legal texts, and history books. It was a space designed for a man who ruled not just with violence, but with terrifying calculated intellect. I sat at the edge of a sleek black glass conference table, my fingers flying across the keyboard of a high-end encrypted laptop Silvio had provided. I had changed to a tailored charcoal gray blouse and matching slacks. Jurek, professional armor that I wore like a shield. The ghost of Marcus's abuse still throbbed occasionally, a dull reminder of his cruelty, but I pushed the somatic discomfort aside. I narrowed my intense focus to the cascading lines of hexadecimal code and financial algorithms illuminating the screen. I was currently auditing the 3% logistics ledger, a secure digital spreadsheet detailing the corporate maritime shipping routes. Silvio Gallo stood near the main monitor on the far side of the office, his dark suit impeccable despite the stressful operational hours. He was currently on a secure, scrambled audio line, negotiating a massive transfer of untraceable assets related to an international shipping container reroute. The stakes were astronomical. If the transfer failed, the syndicate would bleed millions in liquid capital, and their entire overseas supply chain would suffer a catastrophic collapse. Dante stood near the floor-to-soiling window, bathed in the sharp morning sunlight. He wore a bespoke navy suit that accentuated the broad, predatory lines of his shoulders. A heavy crystal tumbler of sparkling water rested on the ledge beside him, though his attention wasn't on the harbor. I could feel the weight of his gaze entirely on me, a heavy, static electricity in the room that sent a prickle of primal warning down my spine in hyper-vigilant awareness. The offshore intermediary is demanding the decryption protocol before they release the escrow funds, Silvio said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that betrayed a hint of strain. He muted the line, looking toward his superior with a tight expression. They are citing a variance in the exchange conversion algorithms. They want the encrypted protocol to verify the load weight against our internal tariff schedules manually. Dante turned slowly, his slate-gray eyes shifting from my reflection in the glass to Silvio. If we hand over the protocol, we expose the entire routing architecture of the Atlantic corridor for the next 3 quarters. Do they have legitimate mathematical grounds for the variance? The ledger shows a 3% discrepancy in the shipping logistics column for tonnage conversion. Silvio replied, his brow furrowing slightly as he tapped a stylus against the glass table. It's minor. It could be a rounding error in the local currency exchange, but it's enough to trigger their automated compliance hold. I stopped typing. The rapid clicking of my keyboard ceased instantly, and the sudden silence in the room was deafening. The numbers on my screen blurred momentarily as my analytical mind engaged, pulling data from the peripheral offshore files I had been meticulously auditing all morning. A 3% discrepancy in the shipping logistics column wasn't a rounding error. In international maritime logistics, especially when layered with cryptographic tumbling across multiple jurisdictions, a neat percentage like that was a fingerprint. Don't give them the protocol, I said. My voice cut through the quiet tension of the executive office, sharp and absolute. Silvio's head snapped toward me, his dark eyes narrowing in surprise. Dante turned fully away from the window, his expression unreadable, but the sudden, absolute focus in his posture signaled that I had his undivided predatory attention. Excuse me? Silvio asked, his tone dangerously polite, carrying the subtle threat of a man who did not tolerate civilian interference during syndicate operations. I didn't cower. I stood up, grabbing the wireless mouse and swiping my localized display directly onto the massive OLED wall monitor. The screen shifted instantly from global tracking maps to a dense, terrifyingly complex matrix of financial transactions, highlighted aggressively in my signature red digital ink. The offshore intermediary isn't experiencing an automated compliance hold, I explained, slipping effortlessly into the clinical, authoritative cadence of my profession. The lingering fear of my circumstances evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of competence. I stepped toward the monitor, pointing at a specific cluster of data points. Look at the conversion rates. They are claiming a variance based on standard metric tonnage. But the shell company holding the escrow is registered in a jurisdiction that defaults to imperial displacement for tariff calculations on raw materials. The discrepancy on the ledgers is small, a mere 3% variance in the shipping logistics column, but to me, it screams like a siren in a silent room. It isn't a mathematical error, it's an artificial lag. I tapped the screen, bringing up a secondary, deeply buried ledger that I had unraveled from the metadata. They are intentionally stalling the transaction. If you transmit the decryption protocol, they won't use it to verify the tariffs. They will use the decryption algorithm to ping your master routing server, clone the encrypted logistics path, and siphon the cargo directly to a secondary buyer in international waters before your ships even dock. It's a classic man-in-the-middle arbitrage trap, disguised as a clerical error. The room went completely, terrifyingly, silent. The hiss of the espresso machine in the adjoining kitchenette seemed to amplify, filling the heavy atmosphere as the reality of my analysis settled over the men. Silvio stared at the data, his dark eyes tracking the mathematical proof I had just laid out in undeniable detail. He was a man of violence, a capo who commanded fear, but he was also a master of logistics. It took him less than 10 seconds to see the invisible razor-thin thread I had pulled. "Son of a bitch," Silvio muttered, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet growl. He looked at me, a flicker of genuine, unmasked respect crossing his hardened features. He wasn't looking at a liability anymore. He was looking at an asset. They embedded a skimming protocol in a fake compliance check. If you had handed over the decryption protocol, you would have lost the cargo, the escrow, and the integrity of your overseas supply chain for the next 9 months. I stated, my posture rigid, ignoring the way my heart hammered against my ribs at the realization of what I was doing. I suggest you counter their demand by citing the imperial displacement variance explicitly. Threaten a hard forensic audit of their localized escrow accounts. They will back down immediately to avoid exposing their own skimming operation to the broader syndicate network. Silvio looked to his boss for confirmation. Dante didn't look at the screen. He wasn't looking at the data or the millions of dollars I had just salvaged. He was looking at me. The sheer overwhelming intensity in Dante's slate-gray eyes was paralyzing. It wasn't just physical desire. It was a profound, almost terrifying awe. He was looking at me not as a fragile civilian he had pulled out of a freezing alley, but as a sovereign force, an intellectual equal, who had just shielded his corporate empire from a catastrophic hemorrhage, using nothing but cold logic and red ink. "Do it, Silvio," Dante commanded softly, his voice a low, resonant vibration that commanded total obedience. "Execute Clara's counter-strategy. Close the route. Then find out exactly who signed off on that offshore intermediary." Silvio gave a sharp nod, immediately unmuting the secure line, and rapidly issuing the counterdemands with a chilling, authoritative finality that promised severe consequences. I exhaled a slow, controlled breath, stepping back from the monitor. The adrenaline of the calculation was fading, leaving me suddenly hyper-aware of how deeply I had just embedded myself into the operational core of a violent underworld. I had just saved them millions. I had proven my absolute competence in a room full of monsters. Dante closed the distance between us. His movements were so silent, so fluid, that I didn't realize how close he was until the intoxicating scent of cedar and whiskey completely enveloped me, entirely overriding the smell of espresso in the room. He stopped mere inches away, his towering frame casting a dark, protective shadow over my workstation. "You see the invisible, Clara," Dante murmured, his words descending to a gravelly pitch that was meant only for me, bypassing my ears to resonate directly in my chest. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the edge of the glass desk. He was deliberately avoiding touching my skin, respecting the physical boundary I had demanded, while completely annihilating the emotional one with his proximity. You dissect lies the way my men dissect bodies. You are a terrifying, brilliant creature. The praise hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. For years, Marcus had systematically degraded my intellect, calling me a glorified calculator, diminishing my worth to keep me small, compliant, and easy to control. Now, the apex predator of the metropolis was standing before me, acknowledging my power, revering the very mind that had been so heavily traumatized and overlooked by the rest of the world. A dangerous, suffocating warmth bloomed in my chest. If I leaned into that praise, if I let myself bask in the profound validation he was offering, I would drown in him. I would lose the carefully constructed independence I had bled to build to protect myself and Leo. I needed the wall. I needed the sterile, clinical distance of my profession to survive the terrifying pull of his gravity. I stiffened my spine, my chin lifting as I forced myself to meet his intense gaze. I locked every trace of vulnerability behind a mask of cold, professional detachment. I am simply performing the duties outlined in my operational consulting agreement, I replied, my voice steady, though my pulse betrayed me, beating frantically at the base of my throat. Identifying systemic vulnerabilities is what you acquired my services for. I am glad I could secure the asset and prevent the exposure of your decryption protocol. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to register the heat of his body radiating against mine, before I dropped the guillotine on the moment. Will there be anything else, boss? The word echoed in the quiet hum of the corporate office, sharp and unforgiving. Dante's reaction was instantaneous. The dark, reverent awe in his eyes fractured, immediately replaced by a cold, searing frustration. His jaw locked, the muscles cording tight beneath his tanned skin. He hated the title. He hated that after I had just proved we operated on the exact same wavelength of ruthless, calculated logic, I was deliberately shoving him back into a generic, transactional box. It was a word that denied everything that was rapidly building between us. Silvio, who had just finished his call and secured the assets, paused. The capo's eyes darted between us, instantly recognizing the lethal shift in the atmospheric pressure. He wisely remained silent, turning his attention back to his encrypted tablet to give us the illusion of privacy. Dante leaned in, his lips a mere breath away from my ear, his voice dropping into a register that was meant only for me. A sound that was equal parts threat and promise. You can build as many ledgers as you want, Clara, he whispered, the dark cadence vibrating through my bones and sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. You can hide behind your forensic audits, your contracts, and your corporate titles. But every time you use that word, you are only reminding me of exactly what I am going to break down. He pulled back, his slate-gray eyes burning into mine with an absolute, unyielding possessiveness that made my breath hitch. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. He simply turned and walked out of the glass-walled office, his heavy footsteps fading down the marble hallway, leaving me standing in the warm morning light. Trembling under the weight of a quiet war I was terrified I was already losing. The sterile, synchronized hum of the corporate servers in the adjoining room had become my metronome. For 3 uninterrupted hours after the offshore logistics crisis, I had buried myself deep in the cascading data arrays, using the endless rows of hexadecimal code as an impenetrable digital fortress. My spine remained rigidly straight against the ergonomic leather chair, the fabric of my generic charcoal blouse pressing uncomfortably against the improperly healed injury. A permanent, aching reminder of a life I was desperately trying to outrun. The sharp, brilliant winter sun had shifted across the ballistic-grade glass of the harbor-facing windows, casting elongated, aggressive shadows across the mahogany floor of the executive office. I stared at the high-resolution screen, my eyes burning with exhaustion, but I refused to blink. I had just decrypted the core file of the 3% logistics ledger. The discrepancy on the ledgers was small, a mere 3% variance in the shipping logistics column, but to Dante Archetti, it screamed like a siren in a silent room. My fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating the fraudulent routing data with practiced, surgical precision. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, a complex web of offshore shell companies that I had untangled with brutal clinical efficiency. The embezzlement architecture was remarkably sophisticated, relying on a cryptographic skimming trap buried deep within transit manifests originating from a subsidiary in Naples. The skimming mechanism was designed to automatically reroute exactly 3% of liquid assets into a blind trust in the Cayman Islands, before the main ledger could even reconcile the daily balance. But the architect of this theft had made one arrogant mistake. They had hard-coded the execution timestamp to align with a server time zone that didn't match the Maritime Port Authority's shipping schedule. That tiny, arrogant temporal mismatch was the thread I pulled to unravel the entire multi-million-dollar siphon. Data did not lie. Ledger entries did not raise their voices. They did not shatter glass, and they did not leave bruises. In the architecture of mathematics, I was in my element. I was competent, untouchable, and safely hidden behind layers of corporate encryption. I was Clara Hensley, forensic accountant, and here I had absolute power. The scent of morning espresso had long since dissipated from the massive executive suite. It was replaced entirely by the heavy, territorial aroma of cedar, expensive leather, and dark whiskey that seemed to radiate from the very walls of Dante's sanctuary. It was an intoxicating, grounding smell that my somatic nervous system kept trying to latch onto for comfort. I ruthlessly denied it. I had already rejected the emerald-woven blanket he had offered me during my first night in the penthouse, refusing the luxury to maintain strict professional boundaries. Comfort was a vulnerability. Comfort was the first step toward lowering my guard, and in a world governed by men who dealt in leverage and blood, I could not afford to be soft. I needed to prove my worth through utility, not through dependency. The heavy mahogany doors did not bang open, but the subtle, engineered shift in air pressure signaled a breach in my isolated environment. Silvio Gallo stepped into the room. The capo moved with his usual terrifying silence, his dark suit impeccable, but the rigid set of his jaw indicated a severe disruption in the syndicate's airtight perimeter. He carried an object in his gloved hands that fundamentally did not belong in the immaculate, high-altitude ecosystem of the financial district. He bypassed Dante's massive black walnut desk and walked directly to the sleek glass conference table where I was working. Silvio placed the object on the surface. It was the black cardboard box. The material was cheap, poorly constructed, and smelled faintly of damp decay and stale industrial storage. A stark, jarring contrast to the bespoke luxury of the penthouse. The corners were crushed, the cardboard frayed and peeling, the lid slightly warped from moisture. I recognized it immediately. It was the exact type of archive box Marcus Thorne used to shove his illegal offshore transactions into. The same box where I had hidden my personal forensic notes before I fled into the freezing rain. My fingers froze over the encrypted laptop keyboard. My pulse accelerated instantly, an involuntary, rapid spike to 110 beats per minute. The air in the room seemed to thin out, the atmospheric pressure dropping as the ambient temperature suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. I stared at the black cardboard box. My lungs tightened. The ghost of Marcus's bourbon-soaked breath seemed to claw its way out of the damp cardboard, infecting the sterile safety of my workspace. Dante turned away from the panoramic window. The fluid, predatory grace of his movement stopped the moment his slate-gray eyes locked onto the cheap, battered object resting on his glass table. The way his broad shoulders shifted, settling into a stance of absolute, lethal readiness, sent a cold shiver down my spine. It bypassed the standard courier intake at the ground floor lobby. Silvio stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble devoid of emotion, though the tension in his broad shoulders betrayed his professional outrage. A third-party delivery proxy dropped it at the reception desk during the shift change. The proxy was unaware of the origin. Security screening protocols confirm there are no explosives, no chemical agents, and no tracking transmitters. But given the aesthetic and the lack of a return address, I deemed it a direct psychological breach. "Open it," Dante commanded softly. The absolute stillness of his towering frame was far more terrifying than if he had drawn a weapon. I didn't wait for Silvio to comply. I needed to maintain the illusion of control. I picked up a silver, heavy-barreled tactical pen from the edge of the desk, sliding the tip under the warped edge of the black cardboard box, and flipped the lid back. The cardboard tore slightly. A pathetic, grating sound in the dead silent room. Inside rested a single jagged shard of green ceramic. It was a broken piece of the cheap coffee mug I used to drink from every morning in my old apartment in East Boston. Wrapped tightly around the sharp edges of the porcelain was a piece of lined notebook paper, secured with a rusted paperclip. The copper taste of blood seemed to flood my mouth as I stared at the handwriting visible on the exposed edge of the paper. It was erratic, deeply pressed into the pulp. Angry and chaotic. Marcus. I didn't reach for the paper with my bare hands. I used the tip of the pen to slide the note off the ceramic shard, flipping it open on the glass table for both men to read. You think you can hide behind his money? I know where your little brother's clinic is. Sign the guarantor line by midnight, or the kid pays my vig. A sudden, violent drop in my core temperature hit me so hard. My vision blurred at the edges, my throat constricting around a phantom lack of oxygen as the reality of his reach invaded my safe harbor. A violent shiver attempted to rack my frame, but I locked my muscles, refusing to let the tremor reach the surface. The psychological tripwire had been snapped. The threat to Leo Hensley was a precision strike against the only vulnerability I had left in the world. The monster from my past was actively hunting the perimeter of the absolute sanctuary I had just been placed inside. The fact that Marcus knew the location of the private, specialized medical facility where Leo was receiving his treatments meant that my old life was bleeding into my new one, threatening to poison the only good thing I had managed to secure. But I was a forensic accountant. I dealt in logic, in ledgers, in undeniable mathematical truths. I severed the emotional panic from my cognitive processing with a brutal, internal guillotine. Thorn is escalating, I said. My voice was a flat, clinical cadence, completely devoid of the terror screaming in the back of my mind. I deliberately stripped him of his first name. He was no longer a man I had married. He was merely a hostile variable in a risk assessment matrix. Dante slowly approached the table. He looked down at the erratic handwriting, and the temperature in the executive office plummeted into the freezing digits. His jaw locked, the muscles cording tight beneath his tanned skin as a dark, lethal shadow passed over his features. The terrifying power he wielded wasn't in loud outbursts. It was in this dead, abyssal quiet. He is attempting to leverage emotional panic to force a financial transaction. I continued smoothly, pushing the notebook paper an inch away with the pen, refusing to let my trembling fingers enter his field of vision. It is a statistically inefficient use of his resources. The clinic where Leo is being treated is currently secured by a rotating detail of your men. Correct, Silvio? 3 men inside the ward, 2 on the perimeter doors, 1 in the surveillance hub. The capo confirmed, his dark eyes watching my robotic composure with a flicker of genuine unease. The security protocol is airtight. We monitor the hospital's central camera feed, and the private elevator requires biometric clearance that only my lieutenants possess. A fly does not land on your brother's bedsheets without my authorization. Then the threat is hollow, I concluded, folding my hands neatly on my lap to conceal the white-knuckled grip I had on my own fingers. I looked up, meeting the terrifying, stormy intensity of the Dawn's gaze. Thorn does not have the tactical capability to breach your perimeter. He is relying on my historical compliance and somatic fear response to make a mistake. You do not need to alter your operational logistics. I will simply ignore the deadline, boss. The word dropped into the freezing atmosphere like a stone down a dry well. Silvio visibly stiffened, taking a deliberate half-step back from the table. Dante did not look at the capo. His slate-gray eyes were burning into mine, analyzing the rigid line of my posture, the aggressive suppression of my trauma, and the sterile, corporate barrier I had just thrown up between us. I had just received a death threat directed at my vulnerable younger brother, from a man who used to fracture my bones. And my response was to issue a clinical status report and call my protector my employer. Silvio, Dante murmured, his speech plunging to a dark and violent timbre that made the glass of the table seem to vibrate. Take that piece of garbage out of my office, burn it, then pull the security footage of the delivery proxy. I want to know exactly which street corner Thorn hired him from. I want the proxy's name, his associates, and his family. We are going to find the rat in the walls, and we are going to make an example out of him. Yes, sir. Silvio grabbed the black cardboard box, gathering it into his hands, and exited the room with the swift, silent efficiency of a man who knew when the air was about to ignite. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut. We were entirely alone. Dante did not yell. He did not slam his fist into the glass. He simply stood there, his towering frame casting a massive, suffocating shadow over my workspace. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, settling back onto my shoulders like a familiar, suffocating blanket. I forced myself to maintain eye contact, refusing to shrink under the weight of his absolute, predatory focus. He was studying me, dissecting the carefully constructed facade I had built to survive. Slowly, deliberately, Dante reached for the back of his own chair. He picked up his tailored topcoat, a heavy dark gray cashmere garment smelling intensely of cedar and leather, used as an initial physical shield of protection during my rescue, and walked around the edge of the conference table. He didn't offer me a polite distance. He closed the gap until the heat of his body was a tangible force pressing against my knees. Your logic regarding his tactical capabilities is sound, Clara, Dante began, his voice a low, lethal purr that sent a fresh wave of electricity straight down my spine. Thorn cannot touch Leo. My men will snap his neck before he clears the hospital lobby. But Thorn's package bypassing the intake desk means the underworld does not yet understand the exact parameters of your placement within my architecture. They still view you as a civilian variable. They think you are an asset that can be intimidated. I stared up at him, my pulse hammering a frantic, elevated rhythm against my throat. He stepped behind my chair. Before I could process the movement, he draped the expensive garment over my shivering shoulders. The sheer weight of the fabric settled over me, a physical shield of protection that carried his heat, his scent, and his absolute authority. It was terrifyingly heavy. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a brand. The lingering cold from Marcus's threat was instantly swallowed by the intense warmth of the cashmere, forcefully overriding my panic with a profound sense of safety. I am an operational consultant, I stated, my voice trembling slightly as I fought to maintain my clinical detachment, my fingers gripping the lapels of his coat, despite my desperate need to push it away. My placement is in your ledgers. I do not interface with the street-level elements of your organization. You interface with me? Dante corrected softly. He leaned down, his large hands resting on the arms of my leather chair, completely caging me in. And as long as you are breathing the air in my buildings, you are a target for anyone looking to probe my defenses. Wearing my coat, carrying my scent on your skin is not a suggestion. It is a mandate, I gasped, a shallow, ragged intake of air. The clean, sharp scent of his cologne, mixed with the dark whiskey on his breath, scrambling my hyper-vigilant sensors. He was so close that every breath I took was entirely comprised of him. When they see you wrapped in my armor, Dante continued, his gaze dropping to my bare, trembling hands, every capo, every street soldier, and every indebted parasite in this city will know that you belong to the Ricchetti family. It is a broadcast of absolute immunity. If Thorn ever manages to get close enough to see it, he will know that touching you will result in the immediate systematic eradication of his entire bloodline. My breath hitched. The promise of absolute, violent protection was the most seductive, dangerous thing I had ever been offered. For a woman who had spent years feeling completely invisible, surviving a solitary war against crushing debt and a violent abuser, the idea of being permanently shielded was a profound temptation. It promised an end to the hypervigilance, an end to checking the locks 3 times, an end to the freezing fear that gripped me every time the phone rang. But it was a trap, a beautiful, heavily woven cashmere trap. To wear a man's coat like a banner of ownership, to bear his protection on my skin, was to surrender my sovereignty. I had just escaped the suffocating ownership of one monster. I could not willingly chain myself to a king, no matter how desperately my fractured soul craved the safety of his shadow. I needed my independence. I needed to know that my value came from my brilliant mind, from my forensic audits and my red ink, not from being the protected property of the city's most feared Don. I had to remain an employee. I had to remain entirely self-sufficient. I locked my knees under the desk. I stiffened my spine, calling upon every ounce of professional armor I possessed. I reached up and tried to push the heavy wool off my shoulders. I cannot accept this, I said. The words were quiet, but they struck the tense atmosphere of the office like the crack of a whip. Dante went entirely still. The subtle feathering of the muscle in his jaw stopped. The stormy gray of his eyes darkened into something utterly abyssal. He didn't let the coat fall. His large hands simply shifted, catching the lapels and holding the heavy fabric securely in place around my trembling frame, refusing to allow me to shed his protection. I appreciate the logistical security it represents, I continued, forcing my tone back into the flat, HR-approved cadence I used to distance myself from the terrifying reality of my life. But accepting personal physical protection implies a dynamic outside the strict bounds of my W-2 employment contract. It violates the boundaries of our consulting agreement. It is highly inappropriate for an employee to accept such possessive behavior from her boss. The word hung in the air between us, a clear transactional boundary, a desperate, terrified refusal to let him past my defensive walls. Dante's reaction was terrifyingly controlled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't yank me from the chair. Instead, he leaned in closer, his broad shoulders blocking out the sunlight, completely eclipsing the room until my entire world consisted only of him. The extreme proximity forced my chin up. "You think a corporate title is going to save you from me, Clara?" Dante whispered, the dark cadence vibrating directly into my bones. It was not a request. It was an absolute, terrifying dismantling of my reality. "You think you can sit in my office, bleed from my ledgers, look death in the eye without blinking, and then hide behind a sterile word like boss when I try to put a shield over your life?" I pressed myself back against the leather, my heart hammering so violently I was certain he could hear it. "I am maintaining a boundary." "I don't care about your boundaries," he interrupted, his voice a low, lethal hum that triggered every primal instinct I possessed. He slowly released one side of the coat lapel. He didn't grab my wrist. He didn't use force. Instead, his long, warm fingers gently traced the rigid line of my jaw, his thumb brushing over the pulse point, frantically beating at my throat. The extreme contrast between his gentle, reverent touch and the violent possessiveness of his words short-circuited my brain. In my world, when I claim something as mine, I protect it, absolutely. You can call me your employer. You can quote your contracts. But every time you use that word, you are only delaying the inevitable. His thumb stroked my jawline once. A slow, agonizingly tender motion that completely betrayed the cold violence of his reputation. "You will wear my protection, Clara," Dante promised softly, his slate-gray eyes entirely consuming mine. "Not because I force you, but because you are going to realize that I am the only safe harbor you have left. And when that day comes, when you finally stop shaking, you are going to stop calling me boss." He didn't wait for my response. He didn't need one. Dante slowly withdrew his hand, the loss of his warmth leaving a sudden, freezing void against my skin. He stepped back, his imposing figure retreating just enough to let the winter sunlight hit my face again. He turned and walked back toward the panoramic window, his heavy footsteps fading against the mahogany floor, leaving me trembling inside the heavy weight of his coat, caught in the aftermath of a quiet war I was rapidly realizing I could never win. The sterile, rhythmic hiss of the mechanical ventilator was the exact opposite of the chaotic, freezing storm that had nearly claimed my life a fortnight ago. It was a precise, predictable sound, operating on a mathematical algorithm of oxygen delivery and pressure support. I stood in the immaculate, soundproofed corridor of the private, high-security medical facility in the West End, staring at the heavy reinforced steel door of room 412. In my right hand, I held a secured keycard, a thick piece of matte black plastic embedded with a micro-cryptographic chip. It was not a standard hospital visitor pass. It was a physical manifestation of syndicate clearance, a terrifyingly exclusive token granting me unrestricted access to the VIP ward where my younger brother was currently being kept alive. I ran my thumb over the raised magnetic strip, calculating the baseline cost of this single floor, the private telemetry monitoring, the 24-hour dedicated nursing staff, the rotating detail of armed men standing in the shadows of the stairwells. It easily exceeded $4,000 a day. A staggering, insurmountable number that Dante Ricchetti had wiped from my ledger with a single signature. The crushing financial anxiety that had suffocated me for years. The constant, terrifying mathematics of survival. The medical debt collectors calling at 3 a.m. The $47,000 past due balance that Marcus had abandoned us with was gone, replaced by a much darker, heavier debt. A debt of proximity. A debt of the soul. I swiped the plastic against the scanner. A heavy, pneumatic click echoed through the corridor, and the door slid open seamlessly. The ambient temperature inside the room was a perfectly calibrated 72 degrees. Leo Hensley was propped up against a mountain of pristine white pillows, his pale skin stark against the dark blue fabric of his hospital gown. He looked fragile, the IV line snaking from the back of his bruised hand connecting him to a towering pole of saline and specialized antibiotics. But despite the physical toll of his chronic condition, his eyes were sharp. Too sharp. He possessed the hyper-vigilant awareness of a boy who had grown up in the shadow of Marcus Thorne's violent, unpredictable outbursts. "You look exhausted, Clara," my brother rasped, his voice thin but steady. He didn't ask about his own chart. He didn't ask about his medication. His gaze immediately locked onto the heavy tailored charcoal blazer I was wearing. Jurek. Professional armor that I used to conceal the lingering pain from my past. I am employed, I corrected smoothly, stepping into the room and letting the heavy door click shut behind me. I moved to the edge of the bed, employing the clinical detachment I used when dissecting fraudulent tax returns. I checked the drip rate on his IV, verifying the numbers against the digital display. There is a significant difference between exhaustion and productivity. The new consulting firm has me auditing their internal maritime logistics. It requires long hours, but the compensation package covers this. I gestured vaguely to the private suite, the monitors, the absolute safety. Leo didn't blink. His thin fingers gripped the edge of the white cotton blanket, his knuckles turning the color of old parchment. There are men in suits standing by the elevator banks. They don't wear ID badges. They don't look at the nurses. They look like the men Marcus used to owe gambling money to. Only 100 times worse. They look like cartel, Clara. A cold spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. But I locked my knees and kept my expression perfectly neutral. I pulled a sleek, ergonomic chair to the side of the bed and sat down, crossing my legs with deliberate, corporate precision. They are private security contractors, I lied, though the technicality of the term offered a thin veneer of truth. The man who owns the logistics firm is highly influential in the financial district. He values his privacy, and he extends that security umbrella to his top-tier employees and their dependents. You are safe here. I am not worried about me, the boy countered, his tone falling to a tense, desperate whisper. He leaned forward, ignoring the warning beep of his heart monitor. I am worried about you. What did you trade for this, Clara? Men who look like that. They don't hand out blank checks for accounting work. They deal in leverage. They deal in blood. You escaped one monster. I won't let you sell your life to another one just to keep my lungs working. The sheer, agonizing truth in his words threatened to fracture the professional mask I had spent weeks building. He saw right through the W-2 contracts and the non-disclosure agreements. He saw the invisible, terrifying gravity of the kingpin who had draped a bespoke cashmere coat over my shivering shoulders in a freezing alleyway. But I could not let Leo panic. Somatic stress was a trigger for his condition. I needed to build a wall of logics dense, so impenetrable, that it would completely shield him from the violent reality of the underworld I had just willingly stepped into. He is not a monster, Leo, I stated, my voice a flat clinical cadence, devoid of the terrifying warmth that bloomed in my chest whenever I thought of those stormy eyes. He is an architect of capital. Marcus was chaotic. Marcus was a coward who used violence because he had no intellectual leverage. The man I work for operates strictly on ledgers, risk assessments, and undeniable mathematical truths. I leaned forward, making sure my brother maintained eye contact, forcing him to absorb the absolute certainty in my tone. It is a transaction, I insisted, my fingernails digging into the leather of my portfolio. The discrepancy on the corporate ledgers was a minor variance, but I found the leak. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a cryptographic skimming trap set by an offshore intermediary. I isolated the variables, traced the phantom routing numbers, and provided his team with the exact geolocation of the theft. In exchange for my intellect, he provides this room. I paused, smoothing the fabric of my blazer, weaponizing a final label to seal the argument, to convince myself just as much as the terrified boy in the bed. There is no emotional debt. There is no physical danger. He respects boundaries, he honors his contracts, and he protects his investments. He is my employer, nothing more. He is my boss, and a boss relies on utility, not possession. The silence that followed my declaration was supposed to be comforting. It was supposed to settle the erratic beating of the telemetry monitor. Instead, the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to plummet into the freezing digits. The heavy reinforced door was not completely latched. It was cracked open exactly 2 inches. I hadn't noticed the subtle shift in the air currents, but my somatic hypervigilance instantly registered the change in the environment. The sterile smell of hospital antiseptic was suddenly violently overridden by the heavy, territorial scent of cedar, expensive Italian leather, and dark whiskey. My breath caught in my throat. My heart rate kicked up a notch, an involuntary rapid spike that I could not control. Through the narrow gap in the doorframe, the shadow of a towering figure remained perfectly, lethally still. Dante. He had bypassed the perimeter guards. He had walked the sterile corridors in absolute silence, arriving just in time to hear me reduce the profound, terrifying connection between us to a cold, calculated line item on a corporate balance sheet. I stared at the shadow, unable to breathe, unable to move. I expected the door to swing open. I expected the furious possessive wrath of a man who had explicitly warned me that the ice I was standing on was dangerously thin. But the door did not move. The muscle feathering, the suppressed violence, the sheer, devastating weight of his rejection radiated through the 2-inch gap like a physical wave of cold air. He didn't barge in to correct me in front of my brother. He didn't raise his voice. The shadow simply shifted. The faint, barely audible sound of bespoke leather shoes turned on the linoleum, and the presence vanished. The scent of cedar slowly faded, sucked away by the hospital's mechanical ventilation system, leaving behind a sudden freezing void against my skin. My chest tightened painfully. I had successfully maintained the professional boundary. I had protected my independence. But as I sat in the sterile light of the medical ward, the victory tasted exactly like ash. 2 weeks later, on a freezing Monday evening, the crushing weight of his continued coldness still sat heavily on my collarbone as the discreet armored vehicle smoothly navigated the slick, rain-washed streets of Boston. The heavy tires hissed over the wet asphalt, a monotonous sound that did nothing to quiet the frantic, analytical loops running through my brain. I stared out the tinted window of the SUV, watching the blurred neon lights of the financial district bleed through the freezing rain. The glass was cool against my temple. The interior of the vehicle smelled faintly of leather and ozone. I had spent the last 2 hours analyzing every micro-expression Dante had projected in that brief, terrifying moment at the hospital door. The math didn't add up. A boss did not stand outside a hospital room in the dark. A boss did not exude a possessive wrath so dense it dropped the ambient temperature of a corridor. And yet, I had to force him back into that box. It was the only way I survived. The journey from the sterile, quiet sanctuary of the West End Medical Facility to the towering architecture of Dante's corporate penthouse dragged on. An agonizing crawl through congested, rain-slicked arteries. I watched the chaotic sprawl of downtown Boston slide past the reinforced glass, each glowing street lamp measuring the distance between Leo's safety and my own complicated reality. As the armored SUV descended the steep concrete ramp into the financial district, the heavy, metallic echo of the closing security gates sealed us off from the stormy street level. The transition to the secure subterranean parking structure beneath Dante's corporate penthouse was supposed to be a return to safety. The architectural layout of the private residential garage was a cavern of reinforced concrete pillars and stark LED lighting. The atmosphere in the subterranean garage plummeted instantly, dropping at least 10 degrees colder than the heated leather interior of the SUV. The damp winter chill instantly seeped through the thin fabric of my blazer as my driver pulled into the designated extraction zone near the private elevator banks. I stepped out of the vehicle, clutching my leather satchel tightly against my side. My low heels clicked against the pristine, gritty concrete floor, the sound bouncing off the low ceilings in a steady, rhythmic cadence. 40 feet to the heavy steel doors that led to the secure elevator, a distance I had walked a dozen times without incident. But my somatic sensors flared. A prickle of dread crawled across my skin, a primal warning system honed by years of surviving a domestic predator. My breath hitched in my throat. I stopped walking. I didn't reach for my phone. That would require looking down, breaking my visual perimeter. I slowly began to pivot, calculating the exact geometry of the shadows cast by the parked cars in the visitor sector. Something was fundamentally wrong. The shadows seemed to warp and shift. A rusted, unmarked gray panel van tore around the corner of a structural pillar, accelerating with reckless, erratic speed. It didn't belong in this high-security sector. It slammed on its brakes, fishtailing violently before aggressively blocking my path to the elevator. The smell of burning rubber and cheap exhaust immediately choked the cold, filtered air. The side door violently slid open. It wasn't just proxies. Marcus Oster himself stepped out, his face pale, desperate, and twisted with manic energy. He wore a cheap, rain-soaked jacket that clung to his thin frame, projecting the pathetic, desperate aura of a man whose debts had finally outpaced his ability to lie. He was flanked by 2 heavy-set men wearing stained work jackets. They reeked of cheap tobacco, stale beer, and the kind of volatile panic that belonged to bottom-feeder enforcers. My ex-husband's gambling debts had clearly reached a catastrophic threshold, forcing him to attempt something as suicidal as breaching Dante Ricchetti's private residence. "Grab her," Marcus barked, his voice cracking with hysteria as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "She signs the guarantor papers tonight, or we start mailing her fingers to the kids' hospital room." The threat was blunt, Chaotic street violence. I didn't scream. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. My brain instantly engaged a clinical risk assessment. 3 styles. My driver was already reacting, reaching for his communications, but Marcus's men were closer. The first thug lunged. I stepped back, swinging my heavy leather satchel directly at his face. The brass buckles caught him across the bridge of the nose, with a sickening crunch. He staggered, swearing violently, but the momentum threw me off balance. The second man flanked me, his massive hand shooting out and closing over my left shoulder. He dug his fingers directly into the old, improperly healed hairline fracture Marcus had given me 2 years ago. The pain was instantaneous and blinding, a sickening spike of white-hot agony that caused the metallic tang of blood to flood my mouth. My knees buckled, my vision swimming with gray spots as he yanked me backward toward the open door of the van. "Stop fighting, Clara, or he breaks the other one." Marcus hissed, his foul presence washing over me. I couldn't breathe. The agonizing, suffocating reality of my past was physically dragging me into the darkness. I was completely invisible again. Then, the world exploded. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a warning. It was the synchronized, apocalyptic efficiency of syndicate security. The heavy steel doors of the elevator lobby violently kicked open, the pneumatic hinges screaming under the force. Silvio Gallo moved faster than my eyes could track, stepping into the garage like a localized hurricane of kinetic violence, followed instantly by a specialized detail of 3 men in dark suits. They didn't shout commands. They didn't negotiate. They executed a perfectly synchronized counter-assault. Silvio crossed the distance in a blur, his expression a terrifying mask of absolute, clinical detachment. He didn't even draw a weapon for the man holding me. He simply lunged, his hand locking onto the thug's wrist with the vice-like grip of a hydraulic press, applying a brutal, upward twist. The distinct, sickening snap of breaking bone echoed sharply through the cavernous garage. The man dropped me with a shriek of agony, his face contorting in disbelief. Before the sound could fully leave his throat, Silvio pivoted seamlessly, driving his knee directly into the attacker's sternum. It was a concussive blow that lifted the heavy-set man entirely off his feet, sending him crashing into the concrete pillar. He crumpled to the ground, completely unconscious before his head hit the floor. The syndicate guards descended on the second thug, and Marcus's frantic driver, with the same terrifying precision. There was no brawl. There was only the blunt, systematic dismantling of a threat within a span of 10 seconds. Marcus froze, the manic energy completely draining from his face, replaced by absolute, paralyzing terror. He realized exactly whose perimeter he had breached. He took one look at Silvio's dead, emotionless eyes and tried to run toward the open bay doors. "Hold him," a voice commanded. The ambient temperature in the subterranean garage plunged toward freezing. Dante Ricchetti stepped out of the private elevator. He didn't rush. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that defied his massive size, his towering frame completely consuming the space as he stepped into the harsh fluorescent light. He wore a tailored black dress shirt, the top buttons undone, no tie, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows to reveal the dark, lethal ink of the syndicate wrapping around his corded forearms. The bespoke elegance of his clothing stood in terrifying, jarring contrast to the sheer, predatory violence radiating from his posture. Every micro-movement he made telegraphed absolute, unyielding authority. He didn't look like an architect of capital. He looked like the devil, summoned directly from the abyss to collect a blood debt. Silvio's men had Marcus pinned against the crushed panel of his own van, his arms twisted painfully behind his back. The coward who had terrorized me for years was weeping, his knees giving out as the Don slowly, methodically walked toward him, the soles of his expensive leather shoes echoing like a death knell on the concrete. Wait, I didn't know," Marcus begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine, struggling against the iron grip of the security team. "She's my wife, she owes me. I didn't know she was working for you, I swear to God." Dante stopped exactly 2 feet from my ex-husband. The absolute, chilling stillness returned, far more terrifying than the physical violence Silvio had just unleashed. Dante didn't pull a firearm. He didn't need to. He reached out, his large hand wrapping around Marcus's throat with slow, methodical inevitability, lifting the man until his toes barely scraped the concrete. "An employee," Dante whispered. The dark cadence of his voice vibrated against the concrete, utterly devoid of mercy. I watched from the floor, my heart hammering a frantic, elevated 130 beats per minute. I couldn't look away. I was witnessing the complete and total dismantling of the professional, transactional boundary I had spent weeks trying to enforce. Dante was proving with brutal, undeniable physical evidence that my clinical ledgers meant absolutely nothing in the face of his primal instinct. You breathed her air, Dante continued softly, his grip tightening just enough to cut off Marcus's frantic gasps. You put your filthy hands on a woman who rests under my absolute protection. Tell your bookies when they come to collect your debts that Clara Hensley is not your property. She is not a line item on a payroll. Dante released him with a flick of his wrist. Marcus collapsed onto the gritty floor, gasping and retching, crawling backward in a pathetic display of absolute submission. Get this garbage out of my sight, Dante ordered Sylvia without looking away from Marcus. Make sure he understands that if he ever looks at this building again, I will personally dismantle him. Silvio nodded once, and his men dragged the sobbing Marcus toward the shadows of the exit ramp, a threat of ultimate ruin hanging heavily in the air. The violent silence that followed was absolute. Dante turned slowly, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, controlled breaths, and locked his slate-gray eyes on me. I was still sitting on the gritty floor, my knees pulled to my chest, my generic corporate blazer covered in dust. My left shoulder throbbed with a sickening heat, and my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't interlock my fingers. The clinical detachment was gone. The forensic accountant had been entirely stripped away, leaving only a terrified, exhausted woman who had just survived an ambush. Dante closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He dropped to one knee on the dirty concrete, completely ignoring the ruin of his bespoke trousers. The drive from this sterile, quiet sanctuary of the West End medical facility back to the subterranean garage of the corporate penthouse had been a blur, leaving me entirely unprepared for the violent ambush that had just unfolded. The terrifying predator who had just orchestrated the utter humiliation of my abuser was instantly replaced by a man, operating on pure, desperate protective instinct. He didn't hesitate. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently gripping my forearms, pulling me up and directly into his solid, unyielding chest. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble against my ear. The contrast was staggering. His touch was shockingly tender, mindful of the bruises, mindful of the terror shivering through my frame. The scent of rain and the copper of adrenaline mixed heavily with his signature cedar and leather, scrambling my senses. I didn't push him away. I couldn't. I buried my face into the collar of his dress shirt, my fingers instinctively curling into the expensive fabric of his vest. "You're shaking," Dante noted, his voice darkening as he gently traced the raw scrapes on my palms, his gaze flashing with a renewed, lethal spark as he saw the physical evidence of my fall. His jaw locked, the muscle feathering violently beneath his tanned skin. "Did they touch you anywhere else, Clara?" I shook my head, fighting a sudden, overwhelming wave of tears. "My shoulder." He just grabbed my shoulder. Dante's large hand carefully, reverently cupped the back of my head, pressing me closer to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. But the terrifying intimacy of the moment, the sheer vulnerability of being completely dismantled in front of him, triggered my deeply ingrained defense mechanisms. My hands pressed against the fine wool of his vest, pushing back just a fraction of an inch. I needed the wall back. I needed the professional boundary that kept my shattered pieces intact. The discrepancy on the ledgers, the 3% variance, that was something I could control. This terrifying possessive heat was not. "I'm fine," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my desperate attempt to sound clinical. I forced my hands to let go of his shirt, stepping back just enough to break the physical contact. "I can walk." "Thank you, boss." The word hung in the freezing air of the garage. It was a sterile transactional label, a pathetic shield completely inadequate for the man who had just burned my abuser to the ground. Dante froze. The chilling stillness returned. His eyes darkened to the color of a winter storm, the possessive wrath I had expected at the hospital, finally breaking the surface with devastating force. His jaw tightened so hard I could see the pulse beating at the corner of his neck. "Don't call me that!" he snapped, his voice a dangerous hum that reverberated against the concrete pillars. The raw authority in his tone completely shattered my attempt at distance. "I am not your boss, Clara, not after tonight." Before I could process the finality of his words, Dante moved. He didn't step back. He shrugged off his heavy cashmere topcoat. The rich fabric caught the harsh fluorescent light as he stepped forward and draped it heavily over my shivering shoulders. The sheer, Suffocating weight of the wool settled over me, like a physical barrier against the world, wrapping me in the thick, territorial scent of wood smoke and expensive leather. He pulled the lapels tight across my chest, his knuckles grazing my collarbone as he sealed the heat in. "You are safe inside," Dante promised, his lips brushing against the crown of my hair, his breath warm and fiercely protective as he effortlessly lifted me into his arms, gathering me and his coat against his chest. He carried me toward the private elevator, his stride long and unyielding. "I told you, Clara, I protect what is mine, absolutely." I squeezed my eyes shut, the residual pain in my shoulder fading beneath the intense heat of his body. The sterile clinical word I had clung to felt utterly ridiculous now. I didn't correct him. I didn't quote a ledger. For the first time in my life, wrapped in the impenetrable fortress of his heavy winter mantle and his unyielding command, I simply let the wall fall, surrendering to the terrifying, magnificent gravity of the king who had just claimed me as his own. The pneumatic hiss of the private elevator doors opening severed the fragile suspension of reality I had allowed myself to inhabit. The transition from the violent, freezing subterranean garage to the absolute sanctuary of Dante's corporate penthouse was jarring, an architectural smash cut that scrambled my already frayed nerves. The ambient temperature here was precisely calibrated to 72 degrees. The air heavily filtered and smelling of old paper, aged bourbon, and the faint citrus note of expensive cleaning solvents. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the echoing chaotic violence that had just unfolded below. He didn't set me down immediately. The Mafia Don carried me across the vast expanse of the living area with a fluid, predatory grace that made a mockery of my own physical weakness. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the Boston Harbor, the dark water glittering with the distant, cold reflections of city lights. My cheek was still pressed against the fine wool of his bespoke vest, my senses completely overwhelmed by his territorial aura. For 3 minutes in that elevator, I had surrendered. I had let his heavy outerwear swallow my fear, allowing his supreme power to temporarily silence the crushing financial anxiety over Leo's medical bills and the bodily hypervigilance that usually dictated my every breath. But as the king of the Boston underworld gently deposited me onto the edge of a massive, deep-tufted leather sofa, the forensic accountant in my mind violently reasserted control. I could not be this woman. I could not be the fragile, rescued civilian weeping in the arms of a dangerous man. I was Clara Hensley. I survived by calculating risks, by analyzing data, by never trusting anything that couldn't be proven on a spreadsheet. I pulled the lapels of his outerwear tighter around my trembling shoulders, forcing my spine into a rigid, professional line. My cheap canvas shoes, still dusted with the gritty, toxic residue of the parking garage, seemed to violate the pristine thickness of the hand-woven Persian rug beneath my feet. I raised my chin, intent on establishing a spatial boundary, but my analytical gaze caught a stark, jarring anomaly. Blood. A jagged, dark smear of it coated the side of Dante's left hand, just below the knuckle. During the chaotic, apocalyptic efficiency of the ambush, when he had dropped to the gritty concrete to pull me from the wreckage of my own panic, his hand must have grazed the shattered glass of the van's side mirror. It was a minor cut, barely a laceration by his violent standards, but against the immaculate, tailored elegance of his rolled-up sleeves and the terrifying stillness of his posture, it screamed like a siren in a silent room. My heart rate, which had just begun to stabilize, spiked again, not out of fear but out of a sudden, overwhelming need to restore order, to fix, to be useful. Utility was my armor. If I was tending to a wound, I was performing a task. I was an asset, not a liability. "You are bleeding," I stated, my voice a flat, measured cadence that sounded entirely foreign after the raw vulnerability I had just displayed downstairs. The man barely glanced at his hand. His slate-gray eyes were locked entirely on my face, tracking the rapid shift in my demeanor, watching the impenetrable wall of glass being hastily rebuilt behind my eyes. "It is nothing, Clara. A scratch from the concrete. Focus on your own breathing. The risk of localized infection in a subterranean structure is statistically significant," I countered, already standing up. My legs shook, the residual adrenaline making my knees feel like water. But I locked my joints and forced myself to move toward the adjacent master bathroom. I had mapped this penthouse meticulously during my first week auditing his corporate operations. I knew exactly where Silvio kept the emergency supplies. "Sit down, please." He didn't argue. He watched me with a heavy intensity that made a shiver of terror race down my spine. But he slowly lowered his imposing frame onto the leather cushion, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. I returned 60 seconds later carrying a high-grade trauma medical kit, a matte black hardened Pelican case that contained enough surgical equipment to triage a gunshot wound, though I only needed the basic antiseptics. I set the heavy box on the low mahogany coffee table between us, the metallic click of the latches echoing sharply in the quiet room. I dropped my knees on the thick rug, completely ignoring the dust, still clinging to my generic corporate blazer. I opened the kit, my fingers moving with practiced, robotic efficiency. I extracted a sterile saline flush, surgical gauze, and a vial of medical-grade iodine. "Give me your hand," I requested softly. He extended his left arm. The physical contrast between us was staggering. His hand was massive, the skin tanned and scarred, a map of violent histories and ruthless retribution. The knuckles heavy with the capacity for extreme, calculated violence. My fingers were pale, trembling slightly, stained with the adrenaline sweat of survival. But as I cupped the underside of his wrist to stabilize his palm, I didn't feel fear. I felt the steady, thrumming pulse of a protector who had just burned my abuser to the ground to keep me safe. I uncapped the saline and flushed the shallow laceration. The cold liquid washed away the drying blood, revealing a clean 2-inch slice along the outer edge of his palm. The copper scent of blood mingled with the sharp, clinical tang of iodine. But beneath it all was his signature scent: cedar, fine leather, and dangerous, expensive power. Dante didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His entire focus remained anchored on the crown of my head, his breathing slow and measured, the heat radiating from his broad chest, enveloping me in a suffocating, intoxicating warmth. I could feel the microscopic tremors in my own wrists contrasting sharply with the terrifying stillness of his muscles. "The cut is superficial. It won't require sutures," I murmured, keeping my eyes firmly fixed on the wound. I could not look at his face. If I met that intense gaze, I would lose the thread of my logic. I applied the iodine with a sterile swab, methodically painting the edges of the laceration. "You compromised your physical integrity to extract me from a statistically low-level threat. That was an inefficient use of executive resources. You think my physical integrity matters when a degenerate puts his hands on you?" His voice was a low, lethal hum, the vibration traveling directly from his chest into the quiet space between us. It wasn't a question, it was a heavy, possessive absolute. I stopped breathing for a fleeting heartbeat. I reached for the surgical tape, my hands shaking so badly I fumbled the roll. I was drowning. The terrifying, magnificent gravity of the man was pulling me under, stripping away the forensic analyst, and leaving only a deeply wounded woman who desperately wanted to be held. But I had spent my entire adult life learning that safety was an illusion. Some stories didn't have neat endings. Some involved living daily in spaces between right and wrong, justice and compromise, love and complications. I could not allow myself to become a complication in a syndicate boss's world. Emotional attachments, family vulnerabilities. They were targets, liabilities. Anyone in my position knows better than to give the world that kind of leverage, especially a world run by someone like Dante or Ketty. If I let this man become my ultimate sanctuary, I gave him the power to destroy me entirely. I secured the white gauze over his knuckles, smoothing the edges with my thumb in a final, agonizingly tender motion. I pulled my hands back, instantly severing the physical connection. The loss of his warmth felt like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, leaving me momentarily breathless. I stood up, taking a deliberate half-step backward, clutching the heavy lapels of his cashmere coat to anchor myself. I raised my chin, employing the sterile, HR-approved cadence that was my last remaining line of defense. "The wound is sterilized," I stated, my voice completely devoid of the chaotic, desperate emotion tearing through my chest. I looked him dead in the eye, weaponizing the one word I knew would reinforce the transactional boundary between us. "Thank you, boss." The word dropped into the quiet penthouse like a live grenade. Dante moved so fast my bodily sensors didn't even have time to register the threat. He didn't stand up. He simply lunged forward from the sofa, his large hands shooting out to grip both of my wrists. The physical sensation of his hold was absolute, firm enough to completely immobilize me, yet meticulously calculated not to bruise the delicate skin or agitate the aching joint in my shoulder. "I warned you," the Don gritted out, his voice a dark, fractured growl that completely shattered the quiet elegance of the room. He pulled me forward, forcing me to step between his spread knees. closing the distance until the fine wool of his vest brushed against the fabric of the coat I wore. His eyes were a violent, swirling storm of desperate frustration and unchecked possessiveness. I warned you about that word, Clara. I am not your boss when it's just you and me in this room, he continued, his grip tightening imperceptibly, his thumbs pressing against my frantically beating pulse points. A boss does not drop to his knees on a concrete floor because he sees you trembling. A boss does not feel his own lungs stop working when he sees another man put a hand on your shoulder. Look at me. I tried to look away, but the sheer magnetic force of his presence demanded compliance. I met his gaze, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The intoxicating scent of cedar and whiskey was suffocating, blurring the edges of my rational mind. I'm not negotiating the terms of my surrender. I'm clarifying the job description. I fired back, my voice trembling, though I stubbornly refused to let a single tear fall. I am an operational consultant. You liquidated Leo's outstanding family medical bills, and in exchange, I am decrypting the 3% logistics ledger to expose your internal leak. That is a transaction. It has clean mathematical borders. If we step outside those borders, I lose the only leverage I have left, my independence. Your independence is a myth, the kingpin countered brutally, his cadence deepening to a dark, intimate drawl that vibrated directly against my collarbone. He released my left wrist, only to move his hand up to cup the side of my face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of my jaw with agonizing tenderness. The contrast between his harsh words and his reverent touch short-circuited my brain. You are using that ledger as a shield. You think if you can quantify what I feel for you, if you can categorize it as a line item on a corporate balance sheet, you won't have to face the reality of what this is. And what is it? I challenged, my voice cracking, the clinical detachment finally fracturing under the crushing weight of his absolute attention. What is the statistical probability of a woman like me surviving in your world? I am a civilian. I am an accountant who wears cheap clothes and carries the psychological baggage of a domestic abuser. You rule an underworld empire. If I stop being your employee, if I become yours, I become a target. I become a vulnerability to you, and you become a monster who can break me worse than Marcus ever could. Dante's jaw locked, a muscle feathered violently beneath his tanned skin. The mention of my ex-husband's name in the same breath as his own was a tactical error. The ambient temperature in the penthouse seemed to plummet into the freezing digits. Do not ever, he whispered, his voice coated in dark, lethal ice, compare me to that pathetic excuse for a man. I did not pull you out of the freezing rain to break you. I did not unleash Silvio and my entire security protocol tonight just to make you a prisoner. I pulled you out of the rain to build a fortress around you. A gilded cage, I corrected, my fingernails digging into his wrists, trying to push him away, though the effort was entirely futile against his solid strength. A beautifully engineered, heavily armed cage. You demand absolute control. You demand possession. You said it yourself. When you claim something, you don't share and you don't let go. That isn't a partnership. That is ownership. And I refuse to be owned to pay off my brother's medical expenses. He stared at me, the brilliant, calculating intellect behind his dark eyes absorbing the terror behind my defiance. He saw the trauma. He saw the years of being diminished, controlled, and financially suffocated by a man who had used my loyalty as a weapon. He realized, in that heavy, suffocating silence, that I wasn't fighting him because I didn't feel the electric, undeniable pull between us. I was fighting him because I was fighting for my survival. Slowly, the predator released my right wrist. He didn't step back, but the aggressive tension in his broad shoulders softened, replaced by a profound, terrifying patience. He kept his hand cupped against my cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray lock of hair that had escaped my professional updo during the garage ambush. You think this is about Leo's medical treatment? Dante murmured, his voice dropping into a dark, intimate drawl that completely bypassed my defensive perimeter and resonated directly in my soul. The moment you found the cryptographic skimming trap in my maritime logistics. The moment you sat in my office and stared me down with red ink and absolute defiance. Your brother's financial burden ceased to exist. I didn't pay it to buy you. I paid it to remove the gun from your head. I shook my head, a microscopic, involuntary jerk of denial. Ledgers have to balance. Not ours, he promised softly, his thumb tracing the curve of my lower lip. Ours started with blood and thunder and a woman stupid enough to open her door to danger. You can keep your boundaries for now. Clara, you can hide behind your audits and your clinical logic. But hear me clearly. He leaned in, his lips a mere breath away from mine, the heat of his body acting as an absolute barrier against the cold reality of the world I had left behind. I will let you call me boss in front of the men. I will let you wear your professional armor when you walk through the corporate headquarters. But when the doors are locked, when it is just you and me in the dark, that word dies. Dante's gaze burned into mine, unyielding, possessive, and terrifyingly devoted. You are not my employee. And I will spend every minute of every day dismantling those professional boundaries, line by line, until you finally admit that you are exactly where you belong. He slowly dropped his hand from my face, breaking the physical contact, though the heavy territorial weight of his presence remained. He stood up, towering over me, his bespoke vest and dark dress shirt projecting an aura of untouchable power. Go wash the dust off your hands, Clara, the Mafia Don commanded quietly, turning his back to me to walk toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Tomorrow, we start auditing the Naples subsidiary. Rest while you can. I stood alone in the center of the vast, luxurious living room, completely engulfed in the heavy cashmere of his bespoke coat. Spectral pain in my joint was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, terrifying warmth blooming in the center of my chest. I had held my ground, I had maintained the boundary. But as I watched the broad, unyielding line of his shoulders outlined against the neon lights of the Boston skyline, I knew the truth. The forensic accountant had survived the night, but my clinical detachment was already gone. As my breathing instinctively slowed, synchronizing with the steady, quiet rhythm of his silence, my frantic pulse finally surrendered, settling into a deep, steady thrum beneath the heavy, cedar-scented warmth of his cashmere coat. Less than 24 hours after the garage ambush.
The transition from the sterile, hyper-vigilant isolation of the corporate penthouse to the opulent,
suffocating grandeur of the underground syndicate gala felt like stepping into a velvet-lined pressure cooker. I had spent the entire morning trying to wash the smell of cordite and adrenaline from my skin, standing in the massive marble shower of Dante's guest suite until the water ran freezing cold. Still, my mind kept replaying the violent, terrifying geometry of the ambush, the shattering glass, the deafening roar of gunfire in the subterranean concrete, and Dante, the way he had moved, not like a businessman, but like a lethal, unchained force of nature, putting his own body between me and the incoming fire. He had wrapped me in his signature charcoal topcoat. The heavy cashmere smelled intensely of cedar and leather, serving as an initial physical shield against the freezing panic. It was a sensory anchor I couldn't seem to shake. Right now, standing in the center of a sprawling architectural space that officially did not exist on any city blueprint or public tax registry, I could still feel the phantom weight of that coat on my shoulders. The aesthetic of the subterranean ballroom, beneath the luxury hotel in the financial district, was a masterpiece of aggressive, unapologetic wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a fractured icy luminescence over the imported Carrara marble floors. The air was thick, heavy with the cloying scent of exotic orchids, vintage champagne, and the underlying, undeniable, metallic tang of dangerous men, operating under a temporary, highly volatile truce. I stood near the edge of the central raised dais, my spine locked in a rigid, perfect professional line. The gown Silvio had procured for me was a deliberate compromise between corporate armor and underworld elegance, a high-necked, long-sleeved sheath of midnight blue silk that offered absolutely zero exposed skin, but clung to my frame like liquid metal. Inside my small clutch rested the secured keycard, the matte black plastic granting me unrestricted access to Leo's secure VIP ward at the hospital. My brother was safe. His medical debt was a completely solved equation. That was the only variable that mattered tonight. I held a chilled crystal flute in my right hand, my pale fingertips tracing the intricate cold engravings on the stem. The tactile sensation of the icy glass grounded me, a sharp somatic anchor against the overwhelming, chaotic sensory input of the room. My heart rate was holding steady at an elevated 85 beats per minute. I was running a continuous clinical risk assessment of the crowd, cataloging the shifting alliances, the whispered threats, and the liabilities of the elite families mingling before us as if they were merely columns in a complex spreadsheet. Dante stood exactly 1 foot to my left, radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable power that warped the atmospheric pressure of the room. He wore a bespoke midnight black tuxedo that emphasized the broad, predatory lines of his shoulders, the crisp white of his shirt contrasting violently with the dark, lethal tan of his skin. The surrounding air in our immediate vicinity seemed dictated entirely by his mood. He was flawlessly playing the role of the sovereign king, his slate-gray eyes scanning the ballroom with cold, calculated precision, but the heavy, territorial sense of cedar and dark whiskey wrapping around me was a constant, physical reminder of his possessive gravity. Silvio Gallo was positioned 10 feet away, blending perfectly into the shadows near a massive structural pillar. The capo's dark suit and dead, emotionless eyes were a silent, heavily armed warning to anyone who so much as considered breaching the Don's perimeter. The opposing delegation is intentionally delaying their approach, I murmured, my voice perfectly modulated, barely carrying over the swelling, melodic strains of the string quartet playing in the far corner. I didn't turn my head to look at Dante, keeping my analytical gaze fixed on the Eastern European delegates gathered near the ice sculptures. I dissected their body language with pure forensic detachment. They are attempting to leverage a perceived weakness in your Atlantic shipping routes. They believe the recent discrepancy on the ledgers, the 3% logistics ledger that we neutralized yesterday, has left your logistics vulnerable to a hostile takeover of the port authorities. Dante shifted his weight slightly, the fine wool of his sleeve brushing against the silk covering my arm. The microscopic friction sent a severe jolt of electricity straight down my spine, instantly triggering a phantom flush of heat across my collarbone. It was the same dangerous heat I felt when he had offered me the emerald-woven blanket back at the penthouse. I had rejected the luxurious liquid emerald fabric to maintain strict professional boundaries. I had to reject this heat too. Their intelligence is outdated, Dante said, his voice a low, dark rumble. They don't know you isolated the variable and mathematically dismantled their intermediary. Then you should let them overplay their hand, I advised, taking a slow, measured sip from the chilled crystal flute. The icy liquid offered a sharp, desperate contrast to the suffocating heat of his proximity. Let them propose a renegotiation of the tariffs based on their false assumption of leverage. When they commit to the terms verbally in front of the other families, you reveal that the Naples subsidiary is completely audited and secure. The discrepancy on the ledgers was small, a mere 3% variance in the shipping logistics column, but to Dante Urquetti, it screamed like a siren in a silent room. You don't just deny them the leverage, you publicly humiliate their financial architects. Dante turned his head slowly, his gaze dropping from the crowd to lock entirely onto my face. The sheer, overwhelming intensity in his expression stripped away the opulent ballroom, the music, and the danger, reducing the entire world to the few charged inches of space between us. He wasn't looking at a fragile civilian who needed saving. He was looking at a brilliant, terrifying creature who dissected underworld politics with the same cold, lethal logic she used on tax fraud. You see the exact geometry of their ruin, the kingpin whispered, his voice a low, dark velvet rumble that bypassed my auditory processing and vibrated directly against my ribs. You are magnificent, Clara. A dangerous, paralyzing warmth bloomed in the center of my chest, threatening to fracture the clinical detachment. The cold, digital wall I relied on for absolute survival. I needed the wall. I needed the transactional boundary to keep from being entirely consumed by the man standing beside me. If I let myself believe the reverence in his eyes, I would lose the professional utility that kept my brother safe. Vulnerabilities were deadly in this ecosystem. Children are targets. Liabilities. Anyone in my position knows better than to hand the world that kind of leverage, and surrendering my heart to a mafia don was the ultimate catastrophic liability. Before I could fully fortify my psychological defenses, a small delegation of older, heavily entrenched Italian-American patriarchs approached our position. They were the old guard, men who viewed women as decorative ornaments or collateral, never as operational assets. The lead figure, an aging patriarch with calculating, hooded eyes, offered a deferential, albeit stiff, nod to Dante before turning his dismissive gaze toward me. Don Ricchetti, the patriarch, began, his tone dripping with practiced, diplomatic oil that failed to hide his underlying disdain. Your new companion is stunning, but bringing a civilian into the inner circle during a tariff renegotiation? It is an unconventional risk. Some might say it projects a lack of operational discipline. I didn't wait for Dante to respond. I didn't need a protector to fight a verbal war of mathematics. I stepped forward, my posture projecting the chilling authority of a woman who held the financial lifeblood of their entire operations within her encrypted hard drive. I thought of the black cardboard box sitting securely in his office, full of my forensic notes that had dismantled Marcus's offshore accounts. I had spent years analyzing the filthy money of terrible men. I was not intimidated by this one. I am not a companion, I stated, my voice a flat HR-approved cadence that cut through the classical music like a surgical scalpel. I am the lead forensic accountant for their Ketty enterprise, and considering your own family's books are currently showing a 7% variance in unaccounted waste disposal revenues across the tri-state area. A variance that strongly suggests federal racketeering exposure. I suggest you reevaluate your definition of risk before dispensing operational advice. The patriarch's face went completely, shockingly pale. The insult was precise, mathematically undeniable, and delivered with polite, devastating neutrality. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I am simply an employee, I continued smoothly, turning my gaze back to the dawn beside me, deliberately weaponizing the word to reinforce my independence in front of the entire elite hierarchy. I provide utility and risk mitigation. Is that not correct, boss? The word dropped into the tense atmosphere like a live, unpinned grenade. The patriarch and his associates awkwardly excused themselves, practically fleeing the immediate vicinity, in a flurry of mumbled apologies. But my victory felt incredibly hollow. I could feel the atmospheric pressure around Dante plummeting into the freezing digits, a localized storm of suppressed wrath gathering, just beneath the immaculate surface of his tuxedo. The Mafia Don didn't react visibly to the departing men. He didn't raise his voice or break his regal, untouchable posture, but the muscle at his jawline feathered violently. His knuckles turned a stark white against the crystal tumbler of whiskey he was holding. He hated the title. He hated that I was using it as a public shield, broadcasting a sterile transactional detachment to the entire underworld when his violent, possessive instinct wanted to brand me as his sovereign equal. You play a very dangerous game with that word, Clara. Dante gritted out, his voice so low it was audible only to me, a dark, fractured growl that completely bypassed the ambient noise. You use it to build your little glass walls. You use it to convince yourself that you are safe from me. But every time you say it, you only remind me of exactly what I am going to tear down when we are alone. I gripped the cold stem of my chilled crystal flute, my pulse hammering frantically against my throat, refusing to back down. I'm not negotiating the terms of my surrender. I'm clarifying the job description. We are at a corporate function. I am your operational consultant, and maintaining that boundary is the only reason they will ever respect my ledgers. We are in a shark tank, he corrected brutally, his slate gray eyes burning with an unchecked, territorial wrath that made my breath hitch. And you are deliberately bleeding in the water, just to prove you don't need my net. Before the electric tension between us could fully detonate, Silvio materialized at Dante's elbow. The capo's expression was grim, a silent, heavy indicator of a severe operational disruption. He leaned in, whispering a rapid string of syllables into his superior's ear. Dante's gaze darkened from storm gray to absolute black, his focus snapping abruptly toward the far entrance of the subterranean ballroom. Stay exactly where you are, Dante commanded me, his voice a lethal vibrating hum that commanded total compliance. Silvio, maintain visual. I have a rat to exterminate. He walked away, his broad shoulders cutting through the dense crowd like the prow of a warship, leaving a rippling wake of nervous silence behind him. I exhaled a shaky, ragged breath, stepping back into the shadow of a massive marble pillar to lower my profile. My somatic sensors were suddenly on hyper-alert. The ambient heat of the ballroom felt immediately oppressive. The scent of the orchids, turning cloying and thick in my throat, without the grounding anchor of his cedar cologne. I lifted the crystal glass to my lips, seeking the sharp, biting cold of the metal to steady my trembling fingers, when a harsh, familiar voice shattered my fragile equilibrium. Look at you, playing dress-up for the mob. The glass stopped exactly 1 inch from my mouth. My heart rate instantly spiked to 120 beats per minute. The phantom ache in my left shoulder throbbed violently, a psychosomatic echo of old fractures and midnight terrors. I didn't need to turn around to recognize the smell of stale bourbon, cheap drugstore cologne, and desperate, volatile panic. Marcus Thorne. I slowly pivoted, my spine locking into a rigid, defensive column of ice. My ex-husband stood barely 3 feet away. He looked entirely out of place in the opulent, highly regulated setting, wearing a rented ill-fitting tuxedo that strained awkwardly across his narrow shoulders. He was sweating profusely, his bloodshot eyes darting around the room with the frantic, terrified energy of a cornered animal waiting for the trap to spring. In his trembling right hand, he clutched a stolen security pass. A heavy, gold-leafed card of syndicate access that was the only reason he hadn't been summarily executed by the perimeter security teams. "How did you get in here?" I demanded, my voice a flat, clinical whisper devoid of the screaming terror clawing at my chest. I immediately began running a complex threat assessment. Silvio was 30 feet away, his line of sight momentarily obstructed by a shifting group of cartel delegates. If Marcus made a sudden, erratic physical move, the capo would drop him in 3 seconds. But 3 seconds was enough time for Marcus to inflict significant somatic trauma. "I have friends," Marcus sneered, though the aggressive bravado was incredibly fragile, cracking audibly under the crushing weight of his lethal surroundings. The rival delegation handed me this pass. They thought it would be funny to bring the accountant's pathetic baggage to the party, to show everyone that Ricchetti's brilliant new pet is just a used-up civilian who used to scrub my floors to pay off my debts. He took a jagged step closer, aggressively invading my physical boundary. My primal instinct was to recoil, to shrink away from the monster who had spent years systematically dismantling my self-worth in dark, freezing apartments. But I was not in that East Boston alleyway anymore. Ours started with blood and thunder, and a woman stupid enough to open her door to danger. But I had evolved past the victim he remembered. I was standing in the center of the underworld, armed with a mind that controlled the financial architecture of a king. "You are a liability, Marcus," I stated, refusing to break eye contact, locking my knees to hide the tremor in my legs. "The opposing syndicate didn't bring you here as a friend. They brought you here as a pawn, a minor insulting distraction. And when they realize you have absolutely no emotional or psychological leverage over me, they will abandon you to the security detail to save their own logistics contracts." "No leverage," Marcus hissed, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate mask of cruelty. He leaned in, trying to weaponize his historical psychological abuse, attempting to seed the very doubts I battled every night in the dark silence of the penthouse. "You think you're safe with him? You think the big bad Don actually cares about a broken calculator? You're just a number on his ledger, Clara. He owns you. He bought your brother's hospital bed so he could use your brain to fix his sloppy books. When he's done with your audits, when you stop being useful, he's going to toss you aside worse than I ever did. You are nothing to these people." The words were meticulously designed to strike the deepest, most terrified core of my trauma. And for one terrifying instant, the cold, suffocating dread clawed at my throat. Was I just an asset? Was the heavy cashmere coat he draped over my shoulders merely a brand of corporate ownership? But then I remembered the violent, possessive warmth in Dante's eyes when I was shivering in the garage. I remembered him dropping to his knees on the gritty concrete, his massive hands trembling as he gently checked my palms for scrapes. Marcus was chaotic and cowardly. Dante was absolute. "You understand nothing about him, and you understand absolutely nothing about me," I replied, my voice projecting a cold, devastating authority that caused several nearby cartel guests to stop their conversations and watch the confrontation. I didn't lower my volume. I wanted the elite hierarchy to hear exactly where my loyalty resided. "He does not own me. He employs me," I declared, my words echoing sharply against the marble floors, slicing through Marcus's pathetic manipulation. "He recognizes my intellect, whereas you only ever saw a target you could exploit and beat. You are a parasite drowning in debt, relying on a stolen security pass to walk into a room where you are completely, fundamentally irrelevant." Marcus's face flushed a dark, furious red. The total failure of his manipulation snapped the last frayed thread of his sanity. He raised a trembling hand, the deeply ingrained instinct to strike me momentarily overriding his terror of the heavily armed environment. Before his muscles could fully complete the twitch, the thermal energy in our immediate radius plummeted to absolute zero. Dante did not materialize. He simply displaced the air, stepping directly behind my ex-husband with the silent, fluid grace of an apex predator. The sheer suffocating mass of the dawn cast a terrifying, inescapable shadow over Marcus. Silvio appeared simultaneously on Marcus's right flank, neutralizing any possibility of escape with dead clinical efficiency. "Finish your thought, Thorn?" Dante whispered. The sound was not a shout. It was a lethal, localized earthquake that vibrated against the crystal chandeliers and turned the blood in Marcus's veins to ice. Raise your hand, please. Provide the operational justification to dismantle you in front of the rival delegation. Offer me one reason to stain this marble. Marcus froze, his hand suspended in mid-air, trembling violently as the reality of his impending death crashed over him. The stolen security pass slipped from his sweaty fingers, fluttering pathetically to the floor like a dead leaf. The man who had terrorized me for years literally whimpered, completely paralyzed by the predatory force standing behind him, his knees buckling under the sheer pressure of Dante's proximity. I stood my ground, clutching the chilled crystal flute, my heart hammering against my ribs in a frantic rhythm. I looked past the cowering shell of my abuser directly at the kingpin. His slate-gray eyes were a violent, churning storm of wrath, fixed entirely on Marcus. The muscle in his jaw was locked so tight it looked carved from granite. He was ready to unleash an apocalyptic level of violence to protect me. He was ready to start a syndicate war right here in the ballroom. He is not worth the disruption to your event, I said smoothly, my voice cutting cleanly through the deadly silence. I stepped forward, deliberately placing myself in Dante's direct line of sight, forcing his gaze away from the threat and onto my calm, clinical detachment. I needed to de-escalate the physical violence, but I also needed to publicly, irrevocably solidify my role in this world. He is an unauthorized, insignificant variable. Remove him from the ledger. I paused, looking deeply into Dante's stormy eyes, fully aware of the psychological knife I was about to twist into his chest to save us both from the fallout of a public execution. I called him boss, not mine. The mafia boss finally snapped at the word. The realization echoed loudly within the pristine, fortified vault of my mind, even as I delivered the final devastating blow to his pride. I am completely secure. Thank you, boss. The humiliation for Marcus was absolute. He was not deemed worthy of a beating. He was being dismissed as a clerical error by the woman he had once controlled, shielded by a titan he couldn't comprehend. But for Dante, the word boss was a devastating, agonizing blow. The public defense of his honor was flawless. I had demonstrated unyielding loyalty and impenetrable competence before the rival syndicates. But by using that specific title in this exact, highly charged moment, I had weaponized our professional boundary to deny his possessive instinct in the most public forum possible. Dante didn't look at Marcus as Silvio silently gripped the coward by the collar and dragged him toward the service exits, removing the trash without a single scuffle. He didn't look at the rival delegation, who were now staring at the scene in pale, terrified realization of their own massive miscalculation. He only looked at me. The muscle in his jaw locked so hard I feared the bone would snap. His broad chest rose and fell with slow, heavy, controlled breaths that barely contained the violent tempest inside him. The absolute, unyielding devotion in his eyes was warring with a dark, suffocating agony. I had maintained my independence. I had kept my professional armor flawlessly intact before the world. But as I watched the intimidating predator silently absorb the rejection, standing entirely still amidst the glittering opulence of the gala, I realized the true heavy cost of my survival. I was safe, but I was no longer mine. 17 days had passed since the violent public confrontation at the subterranean gala. In the immediate aftermath of Marcus's unprecedented infiltration, the sovereign of the Boston underworld had fundamentally altered the geography of my confinement. We traded the humid, claustrophobic heat of the underground ballroom and the glass and steel confines of the financial district for a brutal, blinding expanse of white. The corporate penthouse had been deemed strategically insufficient. Within 12 hours, Leo's entire medical apparatus, his specialized nursing staff, and my high-end forensic workstations were quietly airlifted to the syndicate's primary stronghold, a sprawling, heavily fortified architectural compound hidden deep within the snow-covered Berkshire Hills. I remembered the deafening thrum of the helicopter rotors, cutting through the freezing night air, and the biting sting of ice against my cheeks as I stepped onto the helipad. The surreal sensation of leaving the city lights behind for a skeletal forest buried under 3 feet of winter cemented a chilling realization. I was moving further out of the real world and deeper into Dante Ricchetti's impenetrable shadow. The estate itself was a masterpiece of paranoia, draped in dark, uncompromising luxury. It sat on 400 acres of heavily wooded, impassable terrain that looked less like a home and more like a sovereign nation. The exterior walls were constructed from reinforced concrete, cleverly disguised beneath centuries-old fieldstone, projecting the illusion of a historic manor, while functioning as a military bunker. The windows were triple-paned ballistic glass, thick enough to withstand high-caliber impacts without fracturing. The baseline climate inside the massive, vaulted library where I currently worked was a meticulously maintained 72 degrees, anchored by a roaring fire in a black marble hearth. The golden, flickering light of the flames offered a stark, beautifully agonizing contrast to the freezing, relentless blizzard burying the mountains outside. The snow was falling so heavily that it erased the horizon entirely, trapping us in a silent, white void. I sat at a heavy mahogany table, my fingers moving rhythmically across the encrypted keyboard of my laptop. I was completely engulfed in the Don's winter wrap. He had draped the heavy cashmere over my shoulders before leaving for the city 48 hours ago to personally dismantle the Eastern European logistics hubs that had supplied Marcus with his stolen security pass. Dante hadn't asked if I wanted the coat. He had simply settled it around me, a silent, weighted command to remain warm, to remain safe, to remain his. The dark gray fabric still held the ghost of his signature scent, a potent territorial blend of cedar, expensive imported leather, and dark whiskey. The residual warmth was a somatic anchor, keeping my elevated heart rate in check as I audited the final quarter of the Naples subsidiary ledgers. The financial data was a labyrinth of offshore shells and phantom shipping manifests, but the numbers made sense to me. They were logical, unemotional, and fixed. They did not lie, unlike the men who generated them. The silence in the library was profound, punctuated only by the soft click of my keystrokes and the crackle of the burning logs. Then, the world plunged into darkness. The heavy, comforting hum of the estate's primary HVAC system died instantly. The total blackout lasted exactly 2.4 seconds before the localized emergency generators kicked in, bathing the vaulted room in a harsh, low-level amber glow. The sudden silence that followed the loss of the ventilation system was deafening, pressing against my eardrums like physical pressure. I stopped typing. I did not gasp. I did not jump from the leather chair. My hypervigilant brain instantly severed my emotional panic from my cognitive processing, dropping a brutal internal guillotine between my terror and my logic. My breathing slowed, becoming shallow and measured. A localized power grid failure in a compound equipped with triple redundant subterranean generators was a statistical impossibility. It was not a storm outage. It was a coordinated, hardwired perimeter breach. Someone had severed the primary lines from the outside. Before I could reach for the emergency landline mounted on the far wall, the heavy oak doors of the library violently kicked open, the brass handles slamming into the bookcases with a splintering crack. Silvio Gallo stumbled into the room. The lethal, ghost-like capo, who usually moved with the grace of an apex predator, staggered heavily against the doorframe. The left side of his immaculate dark suit was completely saturated, the fabric heavy and gleaming black in the amber light. He was bleeding profusely, his normally stoic face twisted into a mask of pure physical agony. "Hostiles," the enforcer gritted out, his voice a ragged, breathless rasp as he braced his hand against the mahogany paneling, leaving a dark, smeared handprint on the wood. 2 heavily armed mercenary units. Professionals. Thorne managed to leak the geographic coordinates to them from his holding cell before we completely cut off his communications. He traded the location to clear his gambling debts. They bypassed the outer thermal sensors. I was out of the chair before he finished the sentence. The forensic accountant was gone, instantly replaced by a woman who had spent a decade anticipating disasters and managing the catastrophic fallout of violent men. I closed the distance between us in 3 rapid strides, catching the capo's immense weight as his knees buckled. The metallic, overwhelming stench of fresh copper flooded the air, instantly overriding the scent of burning firewood and cedar. "Sit on the floor." "Now," I commanded, my voice projecting a cold, flat authority that left absolutely no room for negotiation. I dragged him down to the thick Persian rug, ignoring the hot blood staining the sleeves of my generic corporate blouse and soaking into the knees of my skirt. I ripped open the ruined jacket and the pristine white shirt underneath. The bullet had traversed the outer edge of his Kevlar vest, tearing a deep, jagged groove through the oblique muscles of his left flank. It was a catastrophic flesh wound, bleeding heavily, tearing through muscle fiber and superficial vessels, but by some miracle, it had missed the vital internal organs. I pressed both of my bare hands directly into the open laceration, a applying maximum physical pressure to the severed vessels. Silvio hissed, his jaw locking in agony, but he did not pull away. The heat of his blood was a shocking contrast to the chill creeping into the room from the compromised perimeter. "Where is the secondary breach?" I demanded, my eyes fixed on the pulsing flow of blood beneath my palms, mentally calculating his estimated blood volume and the time frame before hypovolemic shock became irreversible. "East wing," he gasped, his head rolling back against the base of the bookshelves, his dark eyes glassy with pain. His right hand fumbled at his utility belt, unclipping a heavy, military-grade communication device. He shoved the black transceiver onto the rug beside my knee. "They hit the communications hub. The internal frequencies are jammed. My lieutenants are blind. They are pushing toward the medical ward. They want the boy." A freezing spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, sharp and cold like shattered ice. Children are targets, liabilities. Anyone in my position knows better than to give the world that kind of leverage. Marcus Thorne was entirely incapable of orchestrating a paramilitary assault on a mafia stronghold himself, but the rival syndicates holding his debts were more than willing to use my abuser as a proxy to capture the Don's most valuable forensic asset. And they knew the only way to compel my complete, unresisting surrender was to put a gun to Leo's head. "They won't reach him," I stated, my voice entirely devoid of the screaming terror clawing at my throat. I locked my emotions in a reinforced steel vault at the back of my mind. I kept my left hand pressed brutally hard against Silvio's flank, leaning my entire upper body weight onto the wound to stem the hemorrhage. With my right hand, I snatched the heavy comms unit from the rug. I thumbed the analog override switch, bypassing the jammed digital frequencies, to access the localized, unencrypted emergency band. I dragged my encrypted laptop off the low coffee table, flipping the screen toward me with clumsy, blood-slicked fingers. I didn't need the security cameras. I had spent the last 2 weeks analyzing the financial ledgers of the estate's recent architectural renovations. I knew the structural integrity of every single hallway, every load-bearing wall, and every reinforced steel door, because I was the one who had audited the invoices for the ballistic materials. I knew exactly where the syndicate had reinforced the structure, and exactly where the blueprints lied. "All internal security details, this is Clara Hensley." I barked into the transceiver, my tone an icy, corporate whip that cut cleanly through the static. "Acknowledge on analog channel 4. A burst of static followed, then the frantic, breathless voice of the perimeter lieutenant. "We read you. We are pinned down in the south gallery. They are using heavy breaching charges. We are losing ground. You are not losing ground. You are following a structurally flawed defensive geometry." I corrected smoothly, my eyes scanning the cascading lines of hexadecimal code on my screen as I accessed the estate's digital blueprints. "The hostiles are navigating using the 1998 architectural layouts. They believe the drywall in the south hallway is standard gypsum. It is not. It was retrofitted last month with 2 inches of ballistic-grade titanium interlacing. Do not return fire in the gallery. Fall back to the central rotunda and seal the secondary blast doors, source. If we fall back, they take the gallery." The lieutenant yelled over the deafening pop of automatic gunfire in the background. "Let them take the gallery," I ordered, my voice dropping into a lethal, unyielding register. I wasn't asking, I was dictating terms. "When they reach the end of the south hallway, they will attempt to blow the wall to access the medical wing. The titanium interlacing will violently direct the concussive force of their own breaching charges backward into the confined space. You will trap them in a fatal bottleneck. Move your men now." I released the transmission button. The heavy, agonizing silence in the library was broken only by Silvio's ragged breathing. The capo looked up at me, his dark, pain-clouded eyes widening in profound, dawning realization. He was witnessing a civilian accountant weaponize corporate construction ledgers into an instrument of mass slaughter. I wasn't firing a weapon, but I was directing the lethal geometry of the battlefield with the exact same ruthless efficiency I used to dismantle financial fraud. "You routed them into an explosive trap," the enforcer whispered, coughing a fine mist of blood into his collar. "I balanced the equation," I replied clinically. I shifted my weight, pressing harder into his torn flesh. My hands were completely slick, the horrific, tactile reality of his life slipping between my fingers, demanding all my somatic focus. I could feel the rapid, thready beat of his pulse beneath my palms, a grim countdown to system failure. 5 minutes later, a massive localized shockwave violently shook the foundation of the estate. The heavy crystal decanters on the nearby bar cart rattled fiercely against each other, chiming like sharp, panicked bells. The low, concussive boom echoed through the mahogany floors, a deep vibration that rattled my teeth, followed by an abrupt, ringing silence on the southern perimeter. The comms unit crackled to life on the rug. Target neutralized. The south hallway is structurally sealed by the debris. The medical ward remains completely unbreached. You saved the boy, Clara. I closed my eyes briefly, the phantom ache in my own left shoulder throbbing in rhythm with my racing heart. Leo was safe. The primary tactical objective had been achieved. The men who came to put a gun to his head were dead, crushed by their own flawed intelligence. But the equation was not yet fully balanced. Report perimeter status on the north gate, I demanded, keeping my voice perfectly flat, refusing to let the relief make me careless. 3 hostiles remaining, the lieutenant replied, his breathing heavy. They abandoned the main assault and breached the library courtyard. They are trying to access your location through the reinforced glass. We are moving to intercept, but we are 3 minutes out. 3 minutes. It was an eternity in a firefight. I looked at the floor-to-ceiling, ballistic windows on the far side of the library. Through the swirling, freezing vortex of the blizzard, I could see the dark, armed silhouettes of 3 men moving rapidly across the snow-covered terrace. The external motion sensors had failed. They were carrying heavy thermal lances, specialized equipment capable of melting through the polycarbonate glass in less than 60 seconds. The bright, blinding blue flare of the cutting torches illuminated the falling snow, a daunting beacon of impending violence. They weren't here to kill me. They were here to extract me. Marcus had promised them the human cipher who held the keys to the Richetti Empire's financial architecture. If they killed me, the intelligence died. If they took me, they possessed the ultimate leverage. Silvio, I murmured, my voice dropping into a quiet, hyper-analytical cadence. If they breach that glass, they will use flashbang munitions. You are currently immobile and suffering from severe hypovolemic shock. Your reaction time is compromised by approximately 70%. You cannot defend this room. The capo grimaced, his bloody hand reaching blindly toward the holster at his hip. He unlatched the leather strap and pulled out a massive, intimidating piece of weaponry. He shoved the heavy sidearm across the rug toward my knees. The cold steel of the gun clattered against the wood floor. It was a beautiful, lethal object, the barrel etched with intricate artisan filigree. A stark, violent contrast to the sterile spreadsheets I usually wielded. You take it, the enforcer ordered, his eyes burning with unflinching, uncompromising loyalty to his sovereign. You aim for the center of mass. You do not hesitate, Clara. Dante will burn the world to ash if they take you. I looked at the heavy weapon. I did not pick it up. My brain instantly engaged a devastating, objective risk assessment. If I stayed in the room and attempted to use a firearm I had no training with, against 3 highly trained mercenaries, the statistical probability of failure was 99%. I would miss. Silvio would be executed on the floor. I would be dragged into the freezing storm, and Dante's entire logistical empire would be held hostage. But if the mercenaries acquired their target voluntarily, if I willingly surrendered the asset they were hunting, they would immediately initiate their extraction protocols. They would abandon the assault on the estate. They had no interest in a prolonged firefight with the surviving syndicate guards once they had the prize. Silvio would receive medical triage. Leo would remain secure behind the titanium walls. The calculable reality was undeniable. My life was an acceptable loss to preserve the core syndicate assets and my brother. I slowly removed my bloody hands from Silvio's flank, grabbing a thick stack of sterile gauze from the emergency kit on the table and pressing it hard into his wound. Hold this. Apply continuous pressure. Do not move. I stood up. I wiped the excess blood onto the skirt of my corporate dress, leaving dark, heavy streaks across the gray fabric. I adjusted the heavy cashmere of Dante's bespoke wool coat around my shoulders, drawing the scent of cedar and whiskey deep into my lungs one last time. I walked toward the massive, heavy oak doors of the library, stepping entirely away from the barricaded safety of the inner room. Clara, what are you doing? Silvio rasped, attempting to push himself off the rug, his voice cracking in sheer, unadulterated panic. I am mitigating the operational risk, I stated, my spine locking into a rigid, perfect professional line. I reached for the heavy brass handles of the library doors. I am the target. If I remove myself from the secure perimeter, they will follow the asset. The remaining security detail can secure you and Leo. It is the only logical transaction. No, the capo roared, a sound of pure desperate terror that had nothing to do with his own physical pain. He will kill us all. If you walk out there, Dante will slaughter every man in this compound for letting you go. I didn't answer. I pulled the heavy oak doors open, stepping into the freezing, drafty expanse of the main estate foyer. The atmospheric warmth here was plummeting. The massive front doors of the compound already compromised by the storm outside, groaning under the force of the blizzard. I prepared to walk out into the snow. I prepared to surrender myself to the violent, chaotic mercy of the men Marcus had sent, viewing my own existence as nothing more than a depreciating currency to be spent for the survival of the people I loved. I had spent my entire life paying off debts that weren't mine. This was just one more transaction. A low, heavy vibration suddenly rattled the stone floorboards beneath my feet, and through the swirling snow, the blinding, high-intensity sweep of armored SUV headlights violently cut through the blizzard outside the shattered gates. Then the world exploded for the second time. It wasn't a breaching charge. It was the apocalyptic, unchained wrath of a king who had returned to his castle to find its walls breached. The heavy, reinforced front doors of the estate foyer completely shattered inward, the massive wood and steel hinges screaming as they were violently ripped from the stone architecture. A freezing, blinding vortex of snow and wind tore through the grand entrance, instantly extinguishing the ambient lighting and plunging the cavernous space into swirling shadows. Through the howling storm, a towering, terrifying silhouette emerged. Dante Ricchetti. He moved with a fluid, blinding velocity that defied human mechanics. He was not wearing his immaculate bespoke suits. He was wearing heavy combat gear, his shoulders and chest completely saturated with snow and the dark, unmistakably metallic sheen of fresh blood. He didn't shout commands. He didn't ask for a situation report. He simply became a localized hurricane of kinetic violence. The three mercenaries who had just breached the terrace glass entered the foyer from the flank, their weapons raised, expecting to find a defenseless accountant. They found the devil instead. Dante didn't even break his stride. The boss of the Boston underworld raised a suppressed automatic weapon and executed 3 tactically perfect, lethal shots in less than 2 seconds. The muted, sharp cracks of the gunfire barely registered over the howling wind. The 3 hostiles dropped to the marble floor, simultaneously, their threat permanently, instantly eradicated. The stark, chilling silence that followed. The gunfire was far more daunting than the firefight itself. The only sound was the shrieking wind tearing through the destroyed entrance. Dante lowered the weapon. The heavy combat gear he wore projected an aura of untouchable, godlike power. He stood in the center of the ruined foyer, the freezing blizzard swirling around his broad shoulders like a chaotic halo. His chest was heaving with heavy, controlled breaths, his jaw locked so tightly the bone looked ready to snap. The air around him practically vibrated with lethal, unspent adrenaline. He turned his head, his slate-gray eyes cutting through the darkness and the swirling snow to find me. I stood exactly 10 feet away, frozen in the center of the grand hallway. I was covered in Silvio's blood, my hands stained crimson up to the wrists, the heavy fabric of Dante's luxurious mantle draped awkwardly over my shivering, rigid frame. My corporate dress was ruined, my hair whipped across my face by the freezing draft. The lethal predator dropped the automatic weapon onto the marble floor. It clattered loudly, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. He closed the distance between us in 3 massive strides, dropping to his knees on the freezing, debris-covered floor directly in front of me. The king of the underworld, bowing in the ruins of his own fortress, his large, calloused hands shot out, gripping my forearms with a desperate, crushing intensity. He didn't care about the blood on my clothes. He didn't care about the ruined architecture of his multi-million-dollar estate, or the bodies bleeding out on his expensive marble. His eyes were wide and frantic, scanning every inch of my face, my neck, my shoulders, searching for the source of the horrific amount of blood I was wearing. "Where are you hit?" The Mafia Don demanded, his voice a fractured, ragged growl that completely shattered his regal, untouchable composure. His hands moved frantically over my arms, his thumbs pressing into my pulse points, checking my physical integrity with a blinding, total desperation. "Clara, look at me. Where did they touch you?" "I am uninjured," I replied, by my voice a flat, detached drone. The somatic shock was finally setting in, dropping my core temperature and making my teeth ache, but my analytical brain refused to yield to the emotional collapse. I looked down at the devastatingly powerful man kneeling in the glass and snow before me. The blood belongs to Silvio. He sustained a traversing laceration to the left oblique. He requires immediate surgical triage in the library. Leo is secure in the medical ward. The perimeter is contained. Dante froze. The frantic, desperate movement of his hands stopped. He stared up at me, the brilliant, calculating intellect behind his stormy eyes, processing the cold, chilling detachment in my voice. He processed the trajectory of my movement. I was standing in the open foyer. I was walking toward the exterior doors. I was not hiding. I was surrendering. Slowly the kingpin rose to his feet. He towered over me, the heavy scent of cordite, freezing rain, and dark whiskey completely suffocating the oxygen in the hallway. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. A solid wall of heat and power pushing back the winter storm. "You were walking out," Dante whispered. The sound was not an accusation. It was a horrific, agonizing realization. His gaze dropped to the floor, where I had deliberately left the ornate weapon, resting on a side table near the library doors. "You had a weapon. You had the secure interior. Why were you walking toward the breach, Clara?" I locked my knees, forcing my spine to remain perfectly straight. I could not let him see the terror. I could not let him see how fundamentally broken I was inside, how deeply I believed in my own dispensability. I needed the wall. I needed the logic to protect me from the terrifying reality that someone might actually care if I lived or died. I ran a strategic risk assessment. I explained smoothly, reciting the numbers as if I were reading a corporate quarterly report in a boardroom. The hostiles were heavily armed and possessed thermal breaching equipment. Silvio was incapacitated. The probability of defending the interior structure was statistically negligible. Their primary objective was asset extraction. By voluntarily removing myself from the secure perimeter and initiating a surrender, I guaranteed the immediate cessation of their assault. The strategic trade-off ensured the preservation of your capo, your structural integrity, and my brother. Dante didn't move. He didn't speak. The muscle in his jaw feathered violently, a tiny tremor in a statue carved from rage and grief. "The calculable reality is undeniable," I continued, my fingernails digging painfully into the palms of my bloody hands to ground myself against the overwhelming force of his presence. "My life is an acceptable loss. It is a depreciating asset. I am a civilian accountant with significant psychological baggage. I have no intrinsic value beyond my ability to decrypt your ledgers. Trading my physical presence to Marcus Thorne's proxies to secure the core assets of the Richetti enterprise was the only logical corporate strategy." I paused, raising my chin to look the syndicate's dawn dead in the eye. I weaponized the final label, driving the sterile, transactional boundary deep into the freezing air between us, trying to force him back into the box of an employer, because acknowledging him as anything else would destroy me. "I protected your investments. Thank you, boss." The word dropped into the ruined, storm-ravaged foyer like a nuclear warhead. The devastation was complete. It did not manifest as explosive violence. It did not result in a shouted curse or a thrown object. It manifested as an agonizing collapse of the titan standing before me. Dante physically recoiled, as if I had driven a serrated blade directly into his sternum. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, ragged hiss. His slate-gray eyes, usually so cold, so untouchable and unreadable, shattered entirely, revealing a dark, suffocating abyss of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. He realized the profound, tragic depth of my trauma. He realized that after weeks of draping his heavy cashmere coat over my shoulders, after wiping out my family's debts, after burning Marcus to the ground in a subterranean garage, I still did not view myself as a human being worthy of unconditional protection. I still viewed my life as nothing more than collateral, a bargaining chip, a piece of corporate property to be spent by an employer to balance a ledger. The king of the Boston underworld was completely gutted by the very shield I used to survive. Dante reached out, his massive, blood-stained hands trembling visibly, as he gently gripped the lapels of his own bespoke coat, still wrapped around my shivering frame. He pulled me forward, burying his face into the curve of my neck. He didn't care about his untouchable authority. He didn't care about the frozen wind howling through his destroyed home, or the blood smearing across his jaw. "You are not an asset," the Don whispered, his voice cracking, a dark, agonizing sound of pure grief vibrating directly against my collarbone. His arms wrapped around my waist, crushing me to his solid chest, with a desperate, devastating possessiveness that defied every ledger, every contract, and every logical boundary I had ever built. You are my heart. You are my entire world. And if you ever calculate the value of your own life like a line item on a spreadsheet again, I will tear this entire syndicate apart with my bare hands." I stood perfectly still in the freezing ruins of the estate, entirely trapped within the suffocating, daunting warmth of his devotion. The detached accountant had balanced the equation, but as the Mafia Don held me together in the dark, his massive body shielding me from the storm, I finally understood the catastrophic reality of my mathematics. I had coldly justified my own execution, and in doing so, I had broken the only man who had ever truly wanted me to live. Exactly 72 hours had passed since the violent apocalyptic breach of the Berkshire Hills compound. The transition from the chaos of the mercenary assault to the pristine, suffocating silence of the estate was a jarring, surreal shift in my reality. The shattered oak doors of the grand foyer had already been replaced with heavy, reinforced steel. The cracked marble swept entirely clean of snow and blood. The overwhelming metallic scent of violence had been scrubbed away, replaced by the sterile smell of industrial bleach and the faint, lingering aroma of wood smoke from the massive stone hearths scattered throughout the sprawling property. I walked the quiet corridors like a ghost, a civilian phantom haunting a military fortress. In the secure medical ward, Leo Hensley remained perfectly stable. I had checked on him an hour ago, accompanied by the designated perimeter guard, who authorized my entry to Leo's secure VIP ward. The heavy biometric door had glided open with a soft hiss, revealing my brother sleeping peacefully. His telemetry monitors tracked a steady, predictable rhythm that proved the absolute effectiveness of the syndicate's perimeter defense. He was safe. For the first time in years, the crushing, astronomical weight of his medical debt wasn't suffocating my every waking thought. Dante had absorbed the burden entirely, neutralizing the threat with the casual, stunning stroke of a pen. Down the hall, in the expansive, wood-paneled library, Silvio Gallo was stubbornly sitting up in a specialized recovery bed that had been wheeled in among the towering bookshelves. The capo was refusing standard bed rest, a thick layer of medical gauze wrapped tightly around his left flank, where the shrapnel had torn through him. Beside his bed sat a matte black hardened pelican case, containing professional surgical equipment and antiseptics kept in the master bathroom, which I had utilized during the assault to slow his bleeding. Despite his catastrophic physical trauma, Silvio was already issuing rapid, low-level logistical commands to his lieutenants through an encrypted transceiver. He completely ignored the pain, his singular focus dedicated to reinforcing the perimeter and ensuring the remaining hostile elements were entirely eradicated. The external threat was systematically eliminated. The mercenary units who had bought Marcus Thorne's leaked coordinates were currently being systematically dismantled in the city by Dante's execution teams. The equation was balanced. The ledger of my life was finally unequivocally clear. But my internal architecture was fundamentally collapsing. I sat at the heavy mahogany desk in my assigned suite in the West Wing, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my high-end encrypted laptop. The forensic accountant had survived the physical firefight. I had successfully calculated a fatal bottleneck to trap the mercenary units, utilizing my spatial awareness and structural knowledge to orchestrate a slaughter that saved Silvio's life. But I could not survive the psychological devastation of the aftermath. In the freezing, ruined foyer, surrounded by the corpses of the men sent to extract me, Dante Ricchetti had dropped to his knees. The king of the Boston underworld had buried his face in my neck, trembling with a raw, agonizing grief that completely shattered the sterile, transactional boundary I used to survive. He had called me his heart. He had declared me his entire world. And in that breathtaking moment of unconditional devotion, I realized exactly how much danger I was truly in. I was not afraid of the syndicate. I was terrified of my own surrender. For years, Marcus Thorne had weaponized love, using it as a manipulative lever to extract compliance, to drain my finances, and to keep me small and invisible in a freezing East Boston apartment. The concept of being owned by a man was synonymous with being destroyed by one. I had fought a brutal, solitary war to establish my independence, using my brilliant clinical mind to build a fortress of logic and W-2 employment contracts. If I stayed in this compound, if I allowed myself to sink into the heavy, cedar-scented warmth of Dante's protection without the shield of a corporate agreement, I would lose my sovereignty. I would drown in his gravity. And when the day came that he realized I was just a broken civilian with trauma she could barely manage, The loss would annihilate me completely. I had to leave before I became a permanent liability to my own soul. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I opened a blank document, applying strict corporate formatting. Times New Roman. Size 12. Justified margins. I forced my breathing into a slow, measured cadence, engaging the detachment that had kept me alive. I began to type, drafting a formal termination document. The terminology was sterile, cold, and meticulously precise. I documented the completion of my forensic audit regarding the 3% logistics ledger. I confirmed that the cryptographic skimming trap embedded within the Naples subsidiary had been permanently neutralized, saving the Ricchetti enterprise millions in liquid capital. I cited the original terms of my operational consulting agreement, noting that the principal balance of $342,000 belonging to Leo had been fully compensated through my intellectual labor. I was quantifying my departure. I was reducing the bloody bond between myself and Boston's most lethal kingpin, down to a standard severance clause. The mechanical whir of the wireless printer in the corner of the room was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I collected the crisp, heavy stock paper, my hands remarkably steady, the familiar stiffness near my collarbone. The old fracture Marcus had given me throbbed with a dull, rhythmic warning. It was a somatic reminder to never trust the illusion of safety. I slid the printed document into a plain manila folder. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored charcoal skirt. I did not wear the mafia boss's signature overcoat, the heavy wool smelling of cedar and leather that he had used as an initial physical shield of protection. The garment remained neatly folded at the foot of my bed, a deliberate, agonizing rejection of the warmth he had draped over me. Neither did I reach for the incredibly fine, liquid emerald blanket he had once wrapped around me. I needed the cold. The cold kept me sharp. I walked out of the suite, navigating the long, quiet corridors of the estate's west wing. The syndicate guards stationed at the intersections did not look at me like an employee. They offered curt, deeply deferential nods, their eyes completely averted. They didn't see a civilian accountant. They saw the Don's chosen partner, a woman who had orchestrated a fatal tactical bottleneck to save their capo. The respect radiating from them was palpable, and it only accelerated the frantic, elevated beating of my heart. I didn't want a crown. I just wanted to survive. I reached the heavy oak doors of the grand foyer, which had been temporarily converted into Dante's command center while the main offices were being swept for bugs. The door was cracked open exactly 2 inches, the warm golden light from the hearth spilling onto the dark hardwood floor. I took a shallow, ragged breath, locking my knees to suppress the involuntary tremor in my legs, and pushed the door wide. The air inside the room was thick, heavy with the intoxicating scent of burning firewood, expensive leather, and dark whiskey. Dante stood near the massive stone fireplace, his broad back to the room as he stared down at the roaring flames. He was not wearing his immaculate bespoke suits. He wore a dark charcoal dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the lethal, intricate syndicate ink wrapping around his corded forearms. The sheer, physical mass of the man was overwhelming, projecting an aura of untouchable power that made the oxygen in my lungs feel inadequate. "The perimeter sweeps are complete," Dante murmured without turning around, his low, resonant baritone vibrating against the acoustic perfection of the vaulted ceiling. He assumed I was one of his lieutenants bringing a security update. "The hostile proxies have been liquidated. Thorne's remaining debts have been bought and erased. There are no more variables, Silvio." "It isn't Silvio," I said. My voice was a flat, detached cadence, completely devoid of the chaotic, desperate emotion clawing at the back of my throat. Dante rose, the fluid, predatory grace of his posture locked into absolute stillness. He turned slowly, his slate-gray eyes cutting through the dim light of the foyer, to find me standing exactly 3 feet from the edge of his massive black walnut desk. He tracked my rigid posture, the absence of his cashmere coat on my shoulders, and the manila folder clutched in my pale, trembling fingers. The brilliant, calculating intellect behind his gaze immediately recognized the shift in my operational parameters. "Clara," he breathed, the single syllable carrying a weight of raw, unguarded relief that almost shattered my resolve on the spot. He took a step toward me, the violent predator instantly replaced by a man operating on pure, desperate devotion. "You should be resting. The somatic shock of the breach requires at least another 48 hours of physical downtime." "I am fully recovered. My physical integrity is no longer compromised," I replied smoothly. stepping forward to intercept his approach. I placed the manila folder squarely on the polished wood of his desk. I aligned the edges perfectly parallel to his leather blotter, a desperate, microscopic attempt to exert control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of my cognitive grasp. Dante stopped. His gaze dropped to the folder, then slowly rose back to my face. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet into the freezing digits. The muscle at his jawline feathered, a tiny lethal warning sign that the atmospheric pressure was about to violently detonate. "What is this?" he asked, his voice sliding to a dark, dangerous register that caused goosebumps to erupt across my skin. "It is a formal termination document," I stated, forcing my chin up, meeting his terrifying intensity with a wall of pure digital logic. "The terms of our operational consulting agreement have been fulfilled. The 3% logistics ledger is clean. The cryptographic skimming trap has been permanently dismantled. The principal debt threatening my brother has been mathematically cleared. I have provided the forensic utility you required, and you have provided the capital I needed. The transaction is complete." Dante didn't move. He didn't blink. He stared at me as if I were speaking a dead, foreign language he refused to translate. "A transaction," the Don repeated softly, tasting the word as if it were coated in shattered glass. "Yes," I insisted, my fingernails digging into the palms of my hands to keep from reaching out to him. "I am returning to Boston. I will arrange for a private medical transport to move Leo to a standard civilian facility, now that Marcus Thorne's leverage is permanently eradicated. It has been a highly educational experience. I appreciate the extreme physical security you provided during the crisis." I paused, drawing a sharp, agonizing breath into my tight lungs. I weaponized the final label, driving the sterile, corporate boundary deep into the freezing air between us. It was the only way to sever the bond before it strangled me. "Thank you for everything, boss." The snap was not a gradual escalation. It was an instantaneous, apocalyptic explosion. Dante slammed both of his massive hands down onto the solid mahogany desk. The concussive, deafening crack echoed like artillery fire in the quiet room, the sheer kinetic force of the impact rattling the heavy crystal decanters on the nearby bar cart. I flinched violently, a microscopic, involuntary jerk backward, but before my brain could even signal my legs to retreat, he was moving. The Don bypassed the massive desk with blinding, shocking velocity. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply became a localized hurricane of wrath, his towering frame completely consuming my field of vision as he cornered me against the heavy, built-in, mahogany bookshelves. He didn't touch my skin. His large hands slammed into the wood paneling on either side of my head, caging me in perfectly. The physical mass of his chest was mere millimeters from mine, his breathing heavy, ragged, and completely unchained. The intoxicating, territorial scent of cedar and dark whiskey was suffocating, entirely overriding my hyper-vigilant sensors. "A termination?" Dante snarled, his voice a dark, fractured growl that vibrated directly into my bones, completely shattering the quiet elegance of the estate. He snatched the manila folder from the desk and ripped the heavy stock paper, precisely in half. Then again, letting the shredded corporate jargon fall like snow onto the Persian rug. "A corporate contract? You think this is a business merger, Clara? You think you can hand me a corporate document, quote a goddamn ledger, and just walk out of my life?" I pressed my spine against the hard spines of the legal texts behind me, my heart hammering a frantic, elevated 140 beats per minute. "The math is settled. You bought my forensic skills to find the skimming trap. I delivered the intelligence. We are even." "We were never even," the Kingpin countered brutally, his slate-gray eyes burning with an unchecked, terrifying obsession that stripped away every ounce of my professional armor. "From the exact second you stood in that freezing alley in East Boston and demanded I spare your brother's life, you belonged to me. I didn't buy your analytical skills, Clara. I claimed your survival. You don't get to claim me," I fired back, my voice cracking, the clinical detachment finally fracturing under the crushing weight of his absolute attention. The terror of my past bled violently into the present. Marcus claimed me too. He owned me. He monitored my ledgers, and he broke my bones when I tried to exert my independence. I will not be owned again. I will not be a piece of collateral locked inside a gilded cage, just because you have the capital to buy my safety. The comparison to my abuser was a catastrophic tactical error. Dante physically recoiled as if I had driven a serrated hunting knife directly into his sternum. The furious wrath in his eyes shattered, instantly replaced by a dark, suffocating agony that was infinitely more terrifying to witness. His jaw locked so tightly I could see the pulse, beating frantically at the base of his throat. He slowly moved his hands from the bookshelves. He didn't step back. Instead, he reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently but firmly wrapping around my wrists. He pulled my trembling hands forward, forcing my palms to rest flat against the center of his chest, directly over the heavy, frantic, desperate beating of his heart. "Does this feel like Marcus?" Dante demanded, his voice dropping into a raw, undeniable whisper of pure devastation. He pressed my hands harder against his sternum, forcing me to feel the biological reality of his devotion. "Does this feel like a coward who wants to keep you small and invisible? I burned the mercenary logistics hubs to the ground for you. I slaughtered 3 highly trained operatives in my own foyer because they dared to look at you. I have restructured my entire global empire to build an impenetrable fortress around your brother's hospital bed. And you are still standing here trying to negotiate a severance package." I gasped, a shallow, ragged intake of air. The solid, thrumming heat of his chest beneath my palms was undeniable. It wasn't the chaotic, erratic heartbeat of a manipulative abuser. It was the steady, unyielding rhythm of a protector who was actively bleeding out from a wound I had just inflicted. "You use that word as a weapon," the Don continued, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse jumping at my wrist, his relentless gaze entirely consuming mine. "You call me boss to remind yourself that you are just an employee. You use it to keep the glass wall intact because you are absolutely terrified of what happens if it breaks." He leaned in, his lips a mere breath away from my cheek, the heat of his breath acting as an absolute barrier against the cold reality of the world outside the compound. "You will call me a king," Dante whispered fiercely, his voice a lethal, vibrating hum that commanded total surrender. "You will call me a monster. You will call me your employer, your client, your assigned security detail. But you refuse to call me yours." The words hung in the heavy, cedar-scented air, tearing through the final, desperate layers of my forensic logic. "You call me boss, not yours," Dante murmured, summarizing the agonizing, silent war we had been fighting since the moment he draped his coat over my shoulders. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes slipping shut as the sheer exhaustion of his vigil overtook him. "You can calculate the structural ruin of an entire syndicate, Clara. You can manipulate architectural blueprints to orchestrate a slaughter, but you are completely, fundamentally terrified of admitting that you are safe with me." I called him boss, not mine. The mafia boss finally snapped at the word. The realization echoed loudly within the pristine, fortified vault of my mind, a brutal summation of my own cowardice. The mathematical equation finally collapsed. The ledger I had spent weeks trying to balance simply ceased to exist. I realized with a sudden overwhelming clarity that my somatic hypervigilance wasn't warning me that Dante was dangerous. It was warning me that my independence was already gone, and that fighting him was only prolonging my own starvation. He didn't want to own me to control me. He wanted to own the right to stand between me and the violence of the world. He was offering a partnership of true, sovereign equality, forged in blood and validated by my own brilliant intellect. The sterile corporate walls I had built inside my mind shattered into a million digital fragments. I didn't step back. I didn't quote a contract. My pale, trembling fingers slowly curled into the fine fabric of his dark charcoal shirt. I dragged my gaze up, meeting the stormy, desperate intensity of the syndicate's terrifying ruler. The tears I had rigidly refused to shed for years, the tears Marcus Thorne had never been able to extract from me through force, finally spilled over my lashes. They were not tears of fear. They were tears of profound, pure relief. "I'm not an employee," I whispered, the words trembling on my lips as the clinical detachment permanently died. I slid my hands up from his chest, wrapping my arms around his broad, unyielding shoulders, fully surrendering to the terrifying, magnificent gravity of his embrace. "I'm yours, Dante. I'm yours." The mafia boss let out a ragged, fractured exhale, the sound of a drowning man finally breaking the surface. His powerful arms wrapped around my waist, crushing me against his solid frame with a fierce, devastating possessiveness that defied every logical boundary I had ever known. He buried his face in my hair, inhaling deeply, anchoring himself to the reality of my surrender. The cold, hypervigilant exhaustion that had defined my entire adult life simply evaporated, replaced by a deep, grounded, and unshakable peace. I was no longer an invisible civilian fighting a solitary war against crushing debt. I was the sovereign partner of a king, and wrapped in the heavy, territorial warmth of his arms. I finally knew I would never have to calculate the odds of my survival again. The fierce, unyielding strength of his hold was an ironclad barricade against the freezing reality I had battled for a decade. I buried my face deeper into the dark charcoal fabric of Dante's shirt, my lungs expanding in a way they hadn't since I was a child. The tears that had finally breached my professional armor soaked into the fine cotton, carrying with them the toxic, suffocating residue of Marcus Thorne's psychological manipulation. For years, I had equated submission with destruction. I had believed that if I allowed a man to hold me, he would inevitably crush me. But the sovereign of the Boston underworld was not crushing me. He was anchoring me. The sheer physical mass of his chest rising and falling against mine wasn't a threat. It was the steady, undeniable rhythm of a protector, who had been willing to tear his own empire apart just to prove I was worthy of survival. Dante did not rush the moment. The violent, localized hurricane of his wrath had entirely dissipated, leaving behind a profound, terrifyingly gentle devotion. His large, calloused hand stroked the back of my hair, the movement slow and deliberately repetitive, a tactile reassurance that the transactional boundaries were permanently eradicated. The intoxicating scent of cedar, expensive leather, and dark whiskey thoroughly overrode my physical hypervigilance. I didn't need to calculate the architectural vulnerabilities of the grand foyer. I didn't need to monitor the heavy reinforced metal doors. The only perimeter that mattered now was the circumference of his embrace. Slowly, the Mafia Don pulled back, just enough to look at my face. The stormy, abyssal agony that had shattered his slate-gray eyes only moments ago was gone, replaced by a burning, unyielding reverence. He brought both of his strong hands up to cup my cheeks, his thumbs gently wiping away the damp tracks of my tears. His skin was warm, the dark ink of the syndicate tattoos corded across his forearms, visible in the flickering golden light of the massive stone hearth. "You are never putting that armor back on with me, Clara," he murmured, his low, resonant baritone vibrating in the quiet space between us. It was not a command born of control, it was a vow. "You will never have to draft another contract to justify your place in my life. The ledgers are closed, the math is done." I nodded, a microscopic, trembling motion, my pale hands reaching up to wrap around his thick wrists. The familiar stiffness near my collarbone was utterly silent. The forensic accountant who viewed herself as a depreciating asset was dead, leaving only a woman who was finally terrifyingly awake. "I know," I whispered, my voice thick but remarkably steady. "I know." Dante's jaw tightened with a dark, heavy emotion. He stepped back a fraction of an inch, just enough to reach into the pocket of his charcoal dress shirt. When he withdrew his hand, a sleek, matte black object rested in the center of his scarred palm. It was the secured keycard. I stared at the piece of technology, my heart rate kicking up a notch, not out of fear, but out of a profound, overwhelming realization. I remembered the day he had first tried to present it to me, shortly after I had decrypted the first layer of his maritime logistics. Back then, I had viewed the matte black plastic card embedded with a micro-cryptographic chip as a physical manifestation of ownership. A beautifully engineered shackle meant to mark me as syndicate property. I had flatly rejected the gift, stating that my operational consulting agreement did not require me to hold unrestricted access to Leo's secure VIP ward or the compound's inner sanctums. I had been so terrified of being possessed that I couldn't see the keycard for what it truly was. It wasn't a gilded cage. It was the keys to the kingdom. "The men in my world understand violence, Clara," Dante began, his baritone hitting a lethal, quiet resonance that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He looked down at the keycard, then back up to my eyes. "They understand leverage, and they understand territory. When I offered this to you the first time, you thought I was trying to buy your compliance. You thought I was trying to make you invisible in my shadow." He took my left hand, his long, warm fingers wrapping gently around my trembling ones. The sheer size difference between us was a stark reminder of his absolute physical dominance, yet his touch was agonizingly tender. "I am not trying to hide you, Clara. I am trying to elevate you," the kingpin declared, his gaze burning with an unchecked, territorial obsession. "This secured keycard is not a brand of servitude. It is a broadcast of absolute sovereignty. When you hold this, every capo, every street soldier, and every elite patriarch in the tri-state area will know that you do not stand behind me. You stand beside me. It is a seal of equal partnership. You are my brilliant, terrifying intellect, and this is the physical proof that my empire answers to you, just as much as it answers to me. The words struck the core of my soul like a physical blow. The professional diminishment I had suffered under toxic bosses. The years of being called a glorified calculator by my abuser. All of it was permanently incinerated by the absolute validation in his heavy, unblinking gaze. Dante Ricchetti didn't just want to protect my body, he worshipped my mind. He saw the forensic auditor who could dismantle a multi-million-dollar skimming trap, and he wanted to hand her the master access to his world. I don't need a contract anymore, I breathed, my pulse hammering a frantic, elevated rhythm against my throat. I didn't pull my hand away. I didn't invoke a corporate title. I simply opened my fingers, offering him my complete, unresisting trust. I don't need the glass walls. Dante's chest heaved with a ragged breath. With meticulous, reverent precision, he pressed the secured keycard into my palm. The cold plastic settled against my skin, the weight of it instantly grounding my frantic senses. It fit perfectly within my grasp. Not a shackle, but absolute, impenetrable armor. I looked down at the dark, polished surface of the micro-cryptographic chip, catching the reflection of the roaring fire in the hearth. Then, I looked up into the eyes of the monster, who had become my only sanctuary. "I told you I was yours," I whispered, stepping forward to close the remaining fraction of space between us. I reached up, my hands sliding past his shoulders to tangle in the dark, heavy hair at the nape of his neck. I pulled him down until his lips were a mere breath away from mine. I weaponized my vocabulary one final time, not to build a boundary, but to permanently obliterate the space between us. "But the equation goes both ways, Dante. You don't just get to claim me, I claim you. You are mine." The mafia boss groaned, a dark, fractured sound of pure, unadulterated surrender, and crashed his mouth down onto mine. The kiss was an apocalyptic event. It was the violent, chaotic culmination of every unspoken threat, every heavy stare, and every terrifying moment of proximity we had shared since the alleyway in East Boston. Dante tasted of expensive whiskey, dark secrets, and absolute devotion. His powerful arms banded around my waist, lifting me entirely off the marble floor, crushing me against his solid frame as if he were trying to fuse our ribs together. I didn't flinch. I didn't calculate the risk. I kissed him back with a fierce, desperate hunger that had been starved for a decade, my fingers gripping the muscles of his back, anchoring myself to the only real thing in a world built on shadows. The word boss was dead, permanently erased from my vocabulary, replaced entirely by the crushing, magnificent gravity of the man who was finally, unequivocally, mine. The next morning broke over the fortified syndicate compound with a blinding, crystalline clarity. The violent blizzard that had raged through the night had completely exhausted itself, leaving behind a silent, pristine expanse of deep, unbroken snow. The freezing, deadly chaos of the mercenary assault felt like a distant nightmare, fully neutralized by the heavy, impenetrable walls of the fortress. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling ballistic windows of Dante's private study, a cup of steaming black coffee in my hand. The interior climate in the room was a perfect, calibrated 72 degrees. I was wearing a pair of Dante's dark slate sweatpants that hung loose on my hips, cinched tight at the waist, and a soft, oversized cashmere sweater that smelled intensely of his cedar cologne. The generic corporate armor I had worn like a shield was gone, burned in the incinerator, along with the blood-stained remnants of yesterday's trauma. The secured keycard rested heavily in the deep pocket of my sweatpants. I traced the smooth edge of the plastic with my thumb, a tactile anchor that brought a deep, grounded sense of peace to my chest. Dante sat at the massive oak desk in the center of the room. He was dressed in a dark, tailored Henley that stretched taut across the broad, predatory lines of his shoulders. He was reviewing a stack of physical documents, his storm-cloud eyes scanning the text with clinical precision. Every few minutes, his gaze would flick up, locking onto my silhouette against the window, as if he needed to visually confirm that I hadn't vanished into the snow. Each time our eyes met, the terrifying, possessive heat in his stare sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. The transactional boundary was gone, leaving only this raw, unfiltered connection. I walked over to the desk, my bare feet completely silent on the thick Persian rug. Without asking for permission, I reached across the expansive mahogany surface and pulled the top file toward me. It was a printed copy of the 3% logistics ledger. My eyes naturally locked onto the rows of numbers, my brain instantly processing the shipping logistics variance that had started this entire chain of events. A small 3% discrepancy that had nearly cost Dante his life and had inexplicably saved mine. I tapped a freshly manicured fingernail against a specific offshore routing number. "You're routing the excess capital through the Caymans before bringing it back to the Boston harbor," I observed, my voice smooth, fully leaning into my expertise. "It's inefficient. If we restructure the holding company to operate out of the Isle of Man, you reduce the tax liability exposure and tighten the shipping timeline by 48 hours. Dante didn't look at the ledger. He looked at my hand, then traced a path up my arm, over the oversized collar of his sweater, straight to my eyes. The sheer, unadulterated pride radiating from him was a physical force. He wasn't threatened by my interference. He was captivated by it. The heavy mahogany doors of the study opened with a soft, pneumatic click. Silvio Gallo stepped into the room. The capo moved slightly slower than his usual fluid, apex predator grace, relying on a sleek carbon fiber cane gripped in his right hand. A thick layer of medical gauze was still visible beneath his crisp white dress shirt, but his dark suit jacket was impeccably tailored to hide the bulk of the bandages. Despite the catastrophic tissue damage he had sustained 24 hours ago, Silvio's dark, emotionless eyes were sharp, scanning the room with absolute operational clarity. I didn't retreat to the corner. I didn't avert my eyes or try to project the image of a harmless civilian employee. I stepped away from the ledger, moving with a quiet, undeniable authority, and took my place directly beside Dante's chair. I rested my left hand on the back of the leather seat, my knuckles brushing against the dark fabric of his Henley. Dante instantly leaned back, pressing his shoulder into my touch, physically aligning his immense power with my presence. Silvio stopped exactly 4 feet from the desk. He did not address Dante first. The capo turned his dark gaze to me, his eyes dropping briefly to the pocket where I kept the key card, before meeting my eyes with a look of profound, unwavering respect. "Donna," Silvio said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It was not a corporate title. It was the highest form of syndicate reverence, an acknowledgement that the forensic accountant had evolved into a sovereign ruler. I gave him a slow, measured nod, acknowledging the shift in the hierarchy without a single flicker of hesitation. "Report, Silvio. The extraction teams in the city have completed the final sweep," the enforcer stated, shifting his weight slightly on the cane. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a heavy metallic object, placing it deliberately on the polished oak of the desk. It was a physical execution ledger. Unlike the cheap, damp cardboard boxes Marcus had used, or the encrypted digital spreadsheets I audited for the company, this was a literal, physical ledger bound in heavy plates of brushed iron. It was a syndicate tradition, an archaic and absolute method of recording the closure of a blood feud. The pages inside were reserved for the final accounting of debts paid in violence. The Eastern European proxy hub that supplied the stolen security pass at the gala has been fully liquidated. Silvio continued, his tone devoid of any empathy. Their shipping lanes have been seized, and their assets have been absorbed into our maritime logistics network. But more importantly, the primary variable has been permanently erased. My heart gave a single hard thump against my ribs. "Marcus Thorne." "Yes," Silvio confirmed, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "When the rival syndicates realized that their mercenary assault on this compound had failed, and that you had orchestrated a fatal tactical bottleneck that wiped out their elite unit, they recognized the catastrophic magnitude of their miscalculation. They knew Dante would unleash an apocalyptic war to retaliate." Dante remained perfectly silent, his gaze fixed on the iron ledger, letting his capo deliver the intelligence, but the subtle, lethal tightening of his jaw confirmed the absolute truth of Silvio's words. To prevent their own total annihilation, the rival patriarchs offered a peace offering, Silvio explained, his voice dropping into a cold clinical cadence. They surrendered the architect of the breach. Marcus Thorne was handed over to our execution teams at a warehouse in the South End at 0400 hours this morning. The debt he owed them was voided. The debt he owed us was collected. The words hung in the warm, cedar-scented air of the study. Marcus Thorne was dead, the spectral pain that had lived beneath my left collarbone for 3 years. A permanent, physical shadow of his violence, suddenly and completely evaporated. The knot of hyper-vigilant tension at the base of my spine uncoiled in a slow, heavy cascade, leaving my limbs feeling loose and strangely weightless. My lungs, which had been locked in a shallow pattern of survival for a decade, finally expanded to their full capacity. The monster who had fractured my collarbone, who had drained my bank accounts, who had used my brother's medical condition as a weapon of psychological torture, was permanently, unequivocally erased from the earth. The crushing financial anxiety, the physical hypervigilance, the terrifying need to look over my shoulder every time I walked to my car. It was all completely eradicated. The poetic justice of the moment was absolute. He had tried to use my brilliance as a bargaining chip, and that very brilliance had engineered his total destruction. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I didn't shed a tear. I simply stared at the execution ledger, the clinical detachment of the forensic accountant, analyzing the final beautifully balanced equation of my life. The liability had been removed. The asset was secure. "Are you certain?" I asked, my voice a flat, uncompromising whip that demanded undeniable proof. "I deal in absolute mathematics, Silvio. I do not accept estimated margins of error when it comes to a threat against my family." Silvio's expression remained grimly respectful. The execution team confirmed the biometric data before the disposal protocols were initiated. "His physical presence has been reduced to ash. The threat is zero, Clara. The ledger is closed." I let out a slow, controlled exhale, the final toxic residue of my past leaving my lungs forever. I looked down at Dante. The Mafia Don was already looking up at me, his eyes burning with an intense, unyielding devotion that eclipsed the violent reality of the news we had just received. He reached up his large, calloused hand, covering mine where it rested on the back of his chair. "Thank you, Silvio," Dante said, his voice a dark, resonant hum that signaled the end of the operational briefing. "Get some rest. I don't want to see you out of that recovery bed for another 48 hours. "Understood," the capo replied. He offered one final, deferential nod to both of us, turned on his heel and exited the study. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, sealing us in our absolute sanctuary. "Before we finalize the transition of those assets," I said softly, breaking the silence as I stepped around the desk, "I need to see him." Dante stood, his massive frame unfolding with predatory grace. "He's awake. The medical team cleared him from the critical list an hour ago." We walked side by side down the silent, reinforced corridors of the compound. The air here was clinical, heavily filtered, a stark contrast to the rich warmth of the study. When we reached the medical ward, I didn't wait for the security detail to assist. I pulled the secured keycard from my pocket and pressed it against the biometric scanner. The heavy metal doors slid open with a soft hiss, granting me the unrestricted access Dante had promised. Leo Hensley was sitting up in the pristine hospital bed, a tray of untouched food resting on the table beside him. A high-grade trauma medical kit sat on the far counter, a stark reminder of the violence that had nearly breached this room. But the high-grade monitors tracking my brother's vitals were beeping in a steady, reassuring rhythm. As soon as Leo saw me, his pale face broke into a fragile but genuine smile. "Clara," he rasped, his voice weak but entirely clear. I crossed the room in 3 strides, leaning over the bed to carefully wrap my arms around his thin shoulders. I was meticulously careful not to disturb the IV lines, but I desperately needed the physical proof that he was alive, that the nightmare hadn't touched him. "I'm here, Leo," I whispered, burying my face in his hair, the scent of antiseptic grounding me in reality. "It's over. We're safe." Dante stood near the doorway, keeping a respectful distance, his massive frame radiating a quiet, impenetrable protection. Leo looked past my shoulder at the Mafia Don. There was no fear in my younger brother's eyes, only a profound, silent understanding. Dante gave the boy a single, solemn nod, a silent vow between the sovereign of the underworld and the family he had sworn to protect. I spent the next 20 minutes reviewing Leo's medical charts with the terrifying competence I usually applied to the 3% logistics ledger, making sure the dosages were precise and his hydration levels were optimal. The crushing weight of unpayable hospital bills that used to paralyze my breathing was entirely gone. Dante had liquidated the debt, but more importantly, he had provided a fortress where my brother could finally heal without a price tag attached to his survival. Once Leo drifted back to sleep, completely safe and heavily guarded, I stepped out of the ward. Dante was waiting for me in the corridor, leaning against the pale wall, watching me with that familiar, burning reverence. He didn't pull me into a frantic, desperate embrace like he had the night before. The desperation was gone, replaced by the calm, terrifying certainty of a king who had finally secured his queen. He stepped close, his towering frame eclipsing the harsh fluorescent lights, casting me in his warm, protective shadow. "The math is settled," Dante murmured, his large hands coming up to gently cup my face. His thumbs traced the high crests of my cheekbones, his touch agonizingly tender against the violent backdrop of his world. There are no more monsters waiting in the dark for you, Clara. There is only me. I leaned into his touch, my hands resting flat against the solid, thrumming heat of his chest. The contrast between the ruthless, cold-blooded kingpin who had just ordered the execution of my abuser and the man looking at me with such profound, naked reverence was staggering. But I no longer feared the contrast. I understood it. The violence was the wall. The devotion was the sanctuary inside. I know, I whispered, a soft, genuine smile finally breaking through the rigid professional mask I had worn for years. And for the record, your internal maritime logistics are still completely a mess. I'm going to have to restructure the entire maritime routing protocol to account for the assets you just absorbed. A low, dark chuckle rumbled deep in Dante's chest, the sound vibrating directly into my palms. It was a beautiful, rare sound that completely transformed the harsh lines of his face. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against mine, his gaze entirely consuming my vision. You can restructure whatever you want, my brilliant girl, he promised softly, his breath washing over my lips, smelling of coffee and dark, intoxicating safety. You own the ledgers, you own the empire, and you, I reminded him, my voice firm, completely devoid of the fear that used to strangle my words. I gripped the fabric of his Henley, pulling him that final, microscopic fraction of an inch closer. I own you. Absolutely, the sovereign whispered right before his mouth claimed mine. I kissed him back, my fingers curling securely into the collar of his shirt. Outside, the freezing wind swept across the snow-drenched mountains, rattling the thick, ballistic glass of the fortress. But inside, in his arms, the cold could no longer reach me.